I drove 3 hours up the winding mountain roads to winterize my cabin, expecting nothing but the quiet crunch of autumn leaves and the sharp chill of November air. Instead, I found a heavy-duty Ford pickup truck parked haphazardly in my driveway. The side doors bore a bright, obnoxious logo for Gary's Pro Build. I did not order a contractor. I approached the cabin, my boots making no sound on the damp earth. Through the living room window, I saw my daughter-in-law Heather tangled in a frantic, desperate embrace with a man who was clearly Gary himself. Their discarded clothes were strewn across the hardwood floor I had polished with my own 2 hands. They were too busy desecrating my property to notice the man who owned it standing just 10 feet away. The sheer audacity of her actions disgusted me, but it did not shock me. Before I reveal what I did next, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe betrayal should always be met with a cold, calculated response. My name is Malcolm Reed. I am 69 years old and I spent 40 years of my life working in the belly of a steel mill. When you spend decades managing blast furnaces that reach 3,000 degrees, you learn a fundamental truth about survival. You never react to the heat by throwing yourself into the fire. You step back, you assess the pressure, and you systematically shut down the valves. I stood outside my own cabin watching the woman my son married betray him on the very sofa I bought for them. My son Derek is 34 years old. He grew up with every advantage I bled to provide, completely shielded from the harsh realities of the world. Perhaps I shielded him too much. He is naive, easily manipulated, and completely blinded by Heather. When he introduced her to the family, I saw through her immediately. Heather always played the role of the perfect loving wife. She wore pearls to family dinners, baked pies from scratch, and spoke to me with a sugary sweetness that always felt like a cheap performance. Beneath that pristine exterior was a deeply entitled woman who only valued what she could extract from others. She thought I was just an old, retired black man living on a fixed pension, someone she could easily manage, patronize, and eventually disregard. She assumed my silence was a sign of ignorance. She had no idea who she was truly dealing with. Any other man might have kicked the door off its hinges. A weaker man would have stormed inside, screaming demands, throwing punches, and demanding explanations. That is exactly what Heather would have expected. She would have cried, played the victim, and manipulated the narrative before I even reached the bottom of the mountain. I gave her no such luxury. I stepped back from the window, pulled out my phone, and turned off the flash. I took 3 clear, high-definition photographs of the truck, ensuring the license plate and the business logo were perfectly legible. I did not make a sound. I walked back to my car, started the engine, and drove away, leaving them to their filthy secret. I drove for 20 miles down the winding mountain road until I reached a diner with a stable cellular connection. I ordered a black coffee, sat in a corner booth, and opened my laptop. My late wife Evelyn used to say my mind worked like a steel trap, locking onto a problem until I dismantled it completely. She was right. Over the last 4 decades, while everyone assumed I was just a blue-collar worker scraping by, I was quietly investing every overtime paycheck into a diverse portfolio of real estate and mutual funds. I built a silent empire worth over $3 million. I live in the same modest house, drive a 10-year-old car, and wear simple clothes because true wealth does not need to shout. True wealth observes, gathers leverage, and strikes only when victory is absolute. I logged into the State Business Registry database. It is amazing what public records will tell you if you know where to look. I typed in the name Gary's Pro Build. The company was registered locally, operating as a limited liability corporation. I pulled up the ownership documents and the tax filings. The business was not a sole proprietorship. Gary was only a co-owner. The primary financial officer and majority shareholder was a woman named Brenda, his wife. A slow, grim realization settled over me. Gary was not just a cheating contractor, and Heather was not just a cheating wife. They were 2 reckless fools gambling with the lives of people who actually held the keys to their stability. Heather relied on Derek for her comfortable suburban lifestyle, and Gary relied on Brenda for his business. They were careless, and careless people leave trails of evidence. I dug deeper into the public directory, cross-referencing Brenda's name with local property records, social media profiles, and professional registries. I learned that Brenda had built the administrative side of the company from the ground up. Gary was simply the face and the muscle. Brenda was the brains. Within 15 minutes, I had her personal cell phone number written down on a napkin. I took a sip of my coffee. The bitterness grounded me. I had a choice to make. I could call my son. I could tell Derek the truth, send him the photos, and watch him confront Heather. But I knew my son. Derek possessed a soft heart and a fragile ego. If I told him, he would confront her without a plan. Heather would deploy her fake tears, weave a masterful web of lies, and somehow convince my son that it was a misunderstanding, or worse, my fault for spying. She would gaslight him into submission, and I would become the villain in their marriage. I refused to let her control the narrative. I needed an ally, someone who shared my lack of sentimentality, someone whose first instinct would be to secure their assets, not cry over broken promises. Brenda, the woman managing the finances of a successful contracting firm, was exactly the kind of person I needed. Women who manage money do not tolerate being stolen from, neither in business nor in marriage. I picked up my phone and dialed the number. I did not hesitate. I did not rehearse what I was going to say. I listened to the line ring once, twice, 3 times. Finally, a woman answered. Her voice was sharp, professional, and slightly impatient, exactly what I expected from someone running a business while her husband played away from home. "This is Brenda," she answered. "My name is Malcolm Reed," I said, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "We do not know each other, Brenda, but we have a common problem." There was a brief pause on the line, the kind of silence that happens when someone tries to determine if they are speaking to a telemarketer or a threat. "What kind of problem, Mr. Reed?" she asked cautiously. I took a slow breath, staring out the diner window at the rugged mountain landscape. I own a cabin up on Blackwood Ridge. I continued enunciating every word with absolute clarity. I drove up this morning to winterize the property. Instead, I found a truck registered to your company parked in my driveway. I heard the rustle of papers shifting on her end. "Gary had a client call up that way today," she replied, defending her business instinctively. "He is checking the plumbing lines." I did not raise my voice. I simply delivered the truth with the precision of a scalpel. "He is doing a bit more than that, Brenda. Your husband is currently inside my living room fixing my pipes, and my daughter-in-law is currently testing them. I have the photographs to prove it. I will wait here at the diner on Route 9. I suggest you come meet me." The line went dead silent. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply hung up the phone. The game had officially begun. I waited in the corner booth of the diner. The coffee in my mug had gone cold. 20 minutes after I hung up the phone, a sleek black SUV pulled into the parking lot. A woman stepped out. She wore a sharp tailored suit, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. She walked through the diner doors, scanning the booths until her eyes locked onto mine. She slid into the vinyl seat across from me. She did not introduce herself. She simply placed her expensive leather handbag on the table and folded her hands. The waitress poured a fresh cup of coffee and walked away, completely oblivious to the silent storm brewing in my booth. I slid my phone across the table. The screen displayed the high-definition photographs of her husband's truck parked outside my cabin alongside a zoomed-in shot of the living room window. I watched her face. A weaker woman would have gasped. A foolish woman would have denied it. Brenda just stared at the screen for a long, agonizing minute. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes narrowed into predatory slits. When she finally looked up at me, there were no tears. There was only the cold, calculating fury of a woman who realized a liability had breached her perimeter. We were cut from the exact same cloth. She handed the phone back to me. Her voice was steady, devoid of any theatrical emotion. "How long did you watch them?" she asked. "Long enough to confirm the identities and secure the evidence," I replied. I did not confront them. Confrontation without leverage is just noise, and I do not make noise. Brenda nodded, a slight gesture of mutual respect. "Good. Gary thinks he is clever. He thinks because I manage the logistics he can operate in the shadows. But he is a sloppy man driven by impulse. I run the payroll. I run the audits. If he is spending company time playing house with your daughter-in-law, he is spending company money to do it." She reached into her handbag and pulled out a sleek silver tablet. She did not ask about Heather. She did not ask for the sordid details of their physical affair. To her, this was no longer a marriage problem. This was an embezzlement problem. And that is exactly why I chose to call her. Brenda typed rapidly on her screen, pulling up commercial banking ledgers. The blue light illuminated her sharp features. "Gary handles the material purchases and subcontractor payouts," she explained, her eyes darting across spreadsheets. "I handle the corporate accounts and tax compliance. Over the past 2 months, Gary has been submitting erratic invoices. He claimed we had supply chain issues, inflation costs on lumber, and unexpected labor disputes. I trusted his assessment because he is the one on the ground. She tapped the screen hard. But numbers do not lie, Malcolm. He has been systematically siphoning cash through dummy invoices. Small amounts at first. 500 here, 1,000 there. Then a massive spike 3 weeks ago. She turned the tablet toward me. A highlighted row displayed a single withdrawal from their corporate reserve. $20,000. My chest tightened. The number hit me like a physical blow to the chest, stealing the air from my lungs. $20,000. I repeated the amount aloud, letting the syllables hang in the stale diner air. I did not need to guess where that money went. I knew exactly where it was. 3 weeks ago, my son Derek came to my house. He sat on my couch, wringing his hands, playing the part of the stressed, hardworking provider. He told me the mountain cabin was depreciating. He told me the foundation was settling, the roof was leaking, and the plumbing was entirely compromised. He begged me for a loan. He said Heather had found a highly recommended contractor who could do a complete winterization and structural renovation for exactly $20,000. He promised he would pay me back with interest once his own business turned a profit. I had written the check that very afternoon. I transferred $20,000 of my hard-earned retirement funds directly into Derek's joint account, believing I was protecting my property and helping my son build responsibility. Brenda watched my face. She saw the realization wash over me. Your son asked you for the money, she stated, not as a question but as a fact. Yes, I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerous register. He asked for $20,000 to pay your husband for cabin renovations. Heather sourced the contractor. Heather managed the transaction. Brenda let out a harsh, bitter laugh. There are no renovations, Malcolm. Gary has not purchased a single plank of wood or a single pipe for your property. My company has no official contract registered for your cabin. That $20,000 was a phantom transaction. I leaned back against the vinyl booth. The absolute brilliance and absolute sickness of their plan became clear. Heather and Gary were not just cheating. They had orchestrated a financial scheme. Heather manipulated my naive son into asking me for the money. I gave the money to Derek. Derek gave the money to Heather to pay the contractor. And Heather handed that money straight to Gary. But Gary never deposited it into his company accounts. He pocketed the cash while simultaneously draining another $20,000 from his own corporate funds to double their illicit nest egg. They were using my money and Brenda's money to finance their affair, their hotel rooms, their expensive dinners, and whatever twisted future they were planning. They turned my son into a cash mule and treated me like a blind ATM. I looked at Brenda. The shared betrayal bound us together in that moment. We were two hard-working, pragmatic people who had built substantial wealth through discipline and sacrifice, and we were currently being robbed blind by the two most parasitic, entitled people in our lives. The sheer disrespect was staggering. I felt a cold, dark anger settle deep into my bones. I was not going to simply expose them. I was going to ruin them. Brenda did not put her tablet away. Her fingers flew across the keyboard with renewed urgency. Gary is stupid, she muttered. Her eyes locked on the screen. He uses the same password for his supply accounts and his personal accounts. He thinks I never check because I respect his privacy. Let us see what other privacy he is violating. She bypassed his primary inbox and accessed a hidden secondary email account he used for supposed junk mail. The inbox loaded. Brenda scrolled past dozens of promotional emails until she found a folder labeled Personal Real Estate. She opened it. Her breath hitched. She pushed the tablet across the table to me. Read this, she demanded. I looked at the screen. It was an email chain between Gary and Heather. Attached to the latest message was a PDF document. I opened the file. It was a drafted real estate contract. My eyes scanned the legal jargon and the true depth of their malice finally materialized. The contract was an agreement of sale for my mountain cabin. The buyer listed was a newly formed shell company named Horizon Developments. A quick glance at the signature block revealed the registered agent for Horizon Developments was Gary himself. The seller listed on the document was my son Derek. I read Heather's accompanying message to Gary. I have the forms ready. Derek is stressed about his business debts. I will convince him that selling the cabin is his only way out. I will get him to forge the old man's signature on the transfer deed. Once the cabin is sold to your shell company, we flip it, split the profit, and leave Derek holding the bag for the forgery. I stared at the screen. They were not just having an affair. They were actively plotting to steal my real estate, commit federal forgery, and send my foolish son to federal prison to cover their tracks. The trap was set. Now it was my turn to close the jaws. The drive to my son's house the next morning felt like a quiet march to a battlefield. The suburban neighborhood was a manicured illusion of stability. Green lawns, pristine driveways, and two-car garages hid the rotting foundations of the marriages inside them. I parked my 10-year-old sedan across the street from Derek's sprawling 4-bedroom colonial. He had purchased it 3 years ago, stretching his credit to the absolute limit because Heather insisted they needed space to entertain her friends. I walked up the paved driveway and pressed the doorbell. I adjusted my posture, smoothing the fabric of my simple button-down shirt, burying the cold fury deep in my chest. To execute a flawless trap, you must first play the prey. The door swung open. Heather stood there, a vision of domestic perfection. She wore a pristine floral apron over a crisp white blouse. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a neat, effortless clip. A warm, sugary scent wafted from the hallway behind her. "Dad," she exclaimed, her voice dripping with an artificial sweetness that made my teeth ache. "What a wonderful surprise. Come in, it is freezing out there." I stepped across the threshold, wiping my boots on the welcome mat. "It smells like cinnamon," I remarked, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "I just took an apple pie out of the oven," she said, beaming as she guided me into the living room. "Derek is in the study working on some business accounts, but he will be thrilled you are here. Sit down, let me get you a slice and a cup of black coffee, just the way you like it." I watched her glide toward the kitchen. Her performance was impeccable. If I had not seen her thrashing on my cabin floor with a contractor less than 24 hours ago, I might have believed she was the devoted, caring woman my son thought he married. She played the role of the dutiful daughter-in-law with the precision of a seasoned actress. She believed her charm was an invisible shield. She thought her polite manners and baked goods could distract a man who spent his life analyzing structural weaknesses in metal and machinery. I sat on the expensive leather sofa I had helped them finance. I observed the perfectly staged living room, the expensive vases, the polished mahogany tables. It was all a facade funded by my retirement money and Derek's crushing debt. Derek emerged from the hallway a few moments later. The sight of my only son sent a sharp pang of disappointment through me, quickly eclipsed by hard reality. He looked terrible. At 34, he possessed the heavy, slumped shoulders of a man carrying a burden he did not understand. Dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes and his shirt was wrinkled. He rubbed his temples as he walked into the living room, forcing a tired smile when he saw me. "Hey, Dad," he said, sinking heavily into the armchair across from me. "Heather did not tell me you were coming. I decided to drop by and see how the renovations were coming along," I replied smoothly, leaning forward. "The mountain cabin project. The one you needed that $20,000 check for." Derek sighed, a long, exhausted sound that rattled in his chest. "It is a slow process. The contractor Gary is doing a thorough job, but structural work takes time. Heather has been coordinating the inspections, so I do not have to drive up there. You know how crazy things are with my supply chain business right now." I kept my face utterly passive. I knew exactly how crazy his business was. He was bleeding cash and his wife was bleeding him dry. "You look exhausted, son," I said, allowing a measured amount of paternal concern to slip into my voice. "Are the margins still tight?" Derek leaned his head back and stared at the ceiling. "Tight is an understatement. Fuel costs are up, client payments are delayed, and the bank is breathing down my neck about the commercial loan. I am drowning in paperwork. If I am being honest, I do not even know how much cash we have in the operating account right now. I just sign where I am told." I narrowed my eyes slightly. "You sign where you are told. By whom?" Derek let out a weak chuckle, pointing toward the kitchen where the sound of clinking plates could be heard. "By Heather, of course. Dad, I do not know what I would do without her. She is a lifesaver. She took over all my financial paperwork 2 months ago. She manages the business ledger, the personal accounts, and the contractor invoices. She says it takes the stress off my plate so I can focus on generating sales." I listened to my son sing the praises of the woman who was actively plotting to send him to federal prison. The blindness was staggering. Derek had always possessed a soft heart, but I never realized how utterly devoid of cynical awareness he was. He handed the keys to his entire livelihood to a woman who viewed him as a temporary host. "She is very efficient," I noted, keeping my tone mild. Derek nodded enthusiastically. "She is brilliant. She even organized the deed paperwork for the cabin renovation. She told me the county required some updated liability waivers and transfer forms for the contractor to pull the right permits. She highlighted the signature lines and I just signed them this morning. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. The transfer forms. He had already signed them. Heather had disguised the fraudulent real estate transfer deed as a liability waiver, and my foolish son had put his signature on it without reading a single paragraph. She is handling everything perfectly, Derek added, completely oblivious to the trap closing around his throat. I am so lucky to have a partner who watches my back. The sheer tragic irony of his statement hung in the air. I looked at the man I had raised, a man who shared my blood but none of my survival instinct. I could not save him by wrapping him in bubble wrap. He needed to feel the cold, hard ground. Heather walked back into the living room carrying a silver tray holding 2 porcelain plates of apple pie and a steaming mug of black coffee. She set them down on the mahogany coffee table with a graceful, practiced smile. "Eat up, Dad," she chimed. "I baked it from scratch just yesterday." I picked up the ceramic mug, letting the heat warm my calloused hands. "Heather," I said casually, "Derek just mentioned those county permit forms you had him sign for the cabin. Did you file the notarized addendum I sent over last week?" Heather froze. Her smile remained, but her eyes betrayed a microscopic flicker of panic. She glanced at Derek, then back at me. "Oh yes, of course," she lied effortlessly. "I filed it with the clerk on Tuesday." I took a slow sip of my coffee. I never sent an addendum. The trap was laid, and she had just stepped firmly onto the trigger. Derek, completely clueless to the invisible warfare happening across his coffee table, pulled out his phone to answer a business call and stepped out onto the back patio. Heather excused herself, claiming she needed to check the oven timer, leaving her expensive designer handbag sitting open on the adjacent armchair. I set my coffee down and leaned over. The gold clasp of the leather tote was undone. Peeking out from a sleek leather folder was a thick stack of legal documents. I tilted my head, letting my eyes scan the exposed papers. The header of the top document was printed in bold, undeniable letters. Durable power of attorney. Below the standard legal text was the signature line. Staring back at me was my own name, Malcolm Reed, signed in blue ink. It was a flawless, terrifyingly accurate forgery. Heather was not just stealing my cabin. She had granted herself total, unchecked legal control over my entire financial existence. My $3 million empire was officially in the crosshairs. I left my son's house with the forged signature burning a hole in my memory. I did not say goodbye to Heather. I simply walked out the front door while Derek was still pacing the patio on his business call. I drove straight to the First National Bank downtown. I have banked at this specific branch for over 40 years. They know my face, they know my history, and they know the exact weight of my financial portfolio. I bypassed the standard teller line and walked directly into the glass-enclosed office of the branch manager, Arthur Vance. Arthur is a man who appreciates protocol, but he took one look at my expression and immediately locked his office door. I sat in the leather chair across from his desk and instructed him to pull a comprehensive audit of my primary retirement accounts. I needed to see every transaction processed within the last 48 hours. Arthur typed quickly, his brow furrowing as the screen populated with data. He turned his monitor toward me, his face pale. "Malcolm, a massive withdrawal was initiated yesterday afternoon," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a concerned whisper. $50,000 was transferred out of your high-yield retirement fund. I stared at the digital ledger. The destination account belonged to Heather. The transaction notes were meticulously filled out, citing the transfer as an approved allocation for preventative medical care. She had used the forged power of attorney to bypass the standard security protocols. Heather had successfully siphoned $50,000 of my money, classifying it as a medical expense to avoid triggering any immediate tax flags. She was paving the way to paint me as a declining, sickly old man who needed round-the-clock supervision. The sheer audacity of her narrative was staggering. She was not just stealing my money. She was actively building a paper trail to erase my autonomy. I looked at the screen, feeling the cold, familiar steel of absolute resolve harden in my chest. The furnace was lit, but I would control the burn. I leaned back in the chair, committing the routing numbers and transaction timestamps to memory. Arthur was already reaching for his desk phone, his hand trembling slightly. "I will freeze the accounts immediately, Malcolm," he said. "We need to contact the fraud department and get the authorities involved right now." I reached across the desk and placed my hand firmly over his. "No, Arthur," I said. "We are not going to freeze anything." Arthur stared at me as if I had just lost my mind. Malcolm. This is active theft. She has a fraudulent power of attorney on file. If we do not lock these accounts down, she could drain your entire life savings by Friday. I looked Arthur dead in the eyes. If you freeze the accounts, she receives an automated notification of the block. She will immediately know I am onto her. She will destroy the evidence, manipulate my son, and bury the money where I can never legally recover it. I am not interested in simply stopping a thief. I am interested in building an inescapable federal cage. I instructed Arthur to implement a different protocol. In the banking world, there are subtle mechanisms designed to monitor high-net-worth clients without alerting unauthorized users. I told him to authorize a silent flag on all my routing numbers and linked investment portfolios. A silent flag does not stop a transaction from being requested. It allows the perpetrator to log in, initiate the transfer, and believe the money is moving. However, the moment the transaction hits the federal clearinghouse, the funds are intercepted and held in a secure escrow by the bank's fraud division. The beauty of the silent flag is the invisible tripwire it creates. Every time Heather attempts to move my money, she will unknowingly generate an automatic report to the federal authorities for wire fraud. I explained the strategy to Arthur. By letting her operate under the delusion of control, we let her commit a felony every time she presses a button on her keyboard. Wire fraud across state and federal banking lines carries severe mandatory minimum sentencing. I want her to feel confident. I want her to get greedy. I want her to reach for the massive trust funds I have hidden in the restricted accounts. Arthur swallowed hard, slowly pulling his hand away from the telephone. He understood the severity of the trap I was laying. He typed the overrides into his terminal, applying the silent restrictions to my entire financial ecosystem. The system is set. Arthur confirmed, his voice tight with anticipation. The $50,000 she already took is gone for now, but any future attempts will trigger a direct alert to the Federal Financial Crimes Division. The money will not leave the bank, but the digital footprint of her crime will be permanently logged. I nodded, satisfied with the architecture of my defense. The first rule of dealing with a parasite is to never let them know you have found the cure. Heather believed she held the ultimate trump card with that forged power of attorney. She thought she was maneuvering pieces on a chessboard, completely unaware that I owned the board, the table, and the room she was playing in. I thanked Arthur for his discretion, stood up, and buttoned my coat. I reminded Arthur that under no circumstances was Derek to be granted access or information if he called. My son was a compromised asset, an unwitting accomplice to his own destruction. Arthur agreed, locking the system profile with a biometric requirement that only my physical presence could bypass. I walked out of the manager's office, the heavy glass door closing behind me with a satisfying click. The financial bleed was effectively stopped and the trap was fully armed. I stepped out of the heavy brass doors of the First National Bank and into the crisp afternoon air. The city streets were bustling with midday traffic. I took a deep breath, letting the cold air clear the lingering scent of polished mahogany and old paper from my lungs. The financial perimeter was secured. Heather could click transfer all she wanted, but she would only be digging her own grave deeper into federal jurisdiction. I reached into my coat pocket to retrieve my car keys. As my fingers brushed the metal, my cell phone vibrated violently against my palm. I pulled the device out and unlocked the screen. A new text message illuminated the display. The sender was Heather. I stared at the short, carefully crafted sentence. "Dad, please come over for dinner tonight. Derek and I have something urgent to discuss regarding your health." I read the words a second time, analyzing the precise, sickeningly sweet tone she always employed when preparing to strike. The mention of my health was not a casual concern, it was a calculated escalation. She had successfully stolen $50,000 under the guise of preventative medical care. Now she was setting the stage for the next phase of her operation. She needed to validate that withdrawal. She needed to convince my naive son that his father was rapidly declining, that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs, and that institutionalizing me was an act of mercy rather than a hostile takeover. I looked at the message, a slow, dark smile spreading across my face. They wanted to discuss my health. They wanted to play doctor and patient. I typed a brief, agreeable response accepting her invitation. I slid the phone back into my pocket and walked toward my car. The predator had invited me directly into her den. I was more than ready to join them for dinner. The dining room table at my son's house was set with fine china and polished silverware, a domestic stage prepared for an execution. The scent of roasted chicken felt thick and suffocating. Derek sat at the head of the table, his posture rigid, his eyes avoiding mine. Heather placed a large ceramic bowl in the center of the table and took her seat beside him. She wore a soft pink sweater, her hair pulled back, the absolute picture of a loving, concerned daughter-in-law. I sat quietly, placing my napkin in my lap, waiting for the first strike. It did not take long. Before I could even reach for a serving spoon, Heather reached into her designer handbag. She pulled out a glossy, heavy stock brochure and slid it across the polished mahogany table. It stopped right next to my plate. The cover featured an elderly man smiling blankly at a nurse under the bold words, "Shady Pines Advanced Psychiatric Care and Memory Center." I looked at the brochure, keeping my face completely devoid of expression. "What is this, Heather?" I asked, my voice calm and steady. Heather inhaled sharply, bringing a trembling hand to her mouth. She forced a tear to well up in her eye, a masterful display of predatory acting. "Dad." She began, her voice cracking with manufactured grief. "We are so worried about you. Derek and I have been talking, and we think it is time to have a serious discussion about your cognitive health. You have been acting so strangely lately." I raised an eyebrow, leaning back in my chair. "Strangely? How so?" Heather let a single tear roll down her cheek. She reached out and grabbed Derek's arm, squeezing it as if she needed his support to deliver tragic news. "Dad, yesterday you transferred $50,000 out of your retirement account. You authorized a massive withdrawal for preventative medical care, and when Derek asked you about it earlier, you did not even remember doing it. Your memory is fading fast. You are making reckless financial decisions, and it has terrified us." She wiped her eyes with a linen napkin, staring at me with a look of absolute sickening pity. "We cannot let you live alone anymore, Dad. You are a danger to yourself. We found this facility. It is very exclusive. They specialize in severe dementia and memory loss. You will be safe there, and I can take over the burden of managing your finances so you do not accidentally bankrupt yourself." She had built her narrative. She stole my money, and now she was using her own theft as the foundational evidence to declare me legally insane. I did not look at the brochure. I did not look at Heather. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at the man sitting at the head of the table. I looked at my only son. "Derek," I said. The single word hung in the silent dining room, heavy with the weight of 40 years of fatherhood. I had worked double shifts in the sweltering heat of the steel mill to buy the food he ate as a child. I had sacrificed my own joints and lungs to pay for his college tuition. I had quietly funded his failing business, bailed him out of bad decisions, and protected him from the harsh realities of a world that does not care about soft men. I stared into his eyes, giving him one final silent opportunity to be a man. One chance to stand up, to question the massive financial discrepancy, to demand evidence to defend the father who gave him everything. Derek stared back at me for a fleeting second. Then he broke. He looked down, unable to hold my gaze. His shoulders slumped, surrendering completely to the woman holding his arm. "Dad." Derek muttered, his voice weak and pathetic. "Heather is right. You have been slipping lately. You forgot about the cabin renovations. You are moving huge sums of money around without telling us, and you are living alone in that big empty house. We cannot sleep at night worrying that you might leave the stove on or wander off into the streets." He kept his eyes fixed on his untouched food, reciting the script Heather had meticulously drilled into his head. "It is the best solution for everyone, Dad. The facility is beautiful. They have gardens and 24-hour care. You will be well taken care of, and Heather can step in to manage your estate so you do not have to stress about paying bills anymore. We are doing this because we love you." He said the word love, and in that exact fraction of a second, the last remaining ember of paternal mercy inside me burned out completely. It did not fade slowly. It extinguished like a candle dropped into an ocean. I looked at my son, and I no longer saw my flesh and blood. I saw a coward. I saw a weak, spineless accomplice who was entirely willing to throw his father into a locked psychiatric ward just to make his own financial life more convenient. He was choosing to believe a manufactured lie because facing the terrifying truth about his cheating wife required a spine he simply did not possess. He was willing to strip me of my freedom, my dignity, and my hard-earned wealth, all because his wife manipulated his fragile ego and told him it was the right thing to do. My chest grew incredibly cold. The fiery, burning anger that had driven me to the bank earlier that afternoon vanished, replaced by an absolute terrifying clarity. A father's job is to prepare his child for the harshness of the world. If my son wanted to operate in the brutal world of predators and thieves, I would stop treating him like a sheltered child. I would treat him like an active enemy combatant. I did not raise my voice. I did not flip the dining table or scream about the stolen money and the forged signature. I simply sat there in the sterile dining room and absorbed the full, crushing measure of his betrayal. "You genuinely believe I am losing my mind, Derek?" I asked, my tone flat, calm, and eerily even. Derek finally looked up, his eyes glassy, his face a portrait of pathetic submission. "Yes, Dad," he whispered. "We have to be realistic. You need professional help, and we are going to make sure you get it." I nodded slowly, letting the dead silence stretch until it became physically uncomfortable. Heather squeezed his arm tighter, shooting him a proud, victorious smile. She thought she had won the war. She thought the old man was broken, defeated by the united front of his loving family. She had no idea she had just severed the only lifeline keeping her husband from total financial and social annihilation. I looked down at my hands resting on the mahogany table. I let my right hand begin to tremble. It was a subtle, deliberate tremor, exactly the kind of physical weakness Heather was hoping to see. I reached for my glass of water, letting my fingers shake just enough to make the ice clink against the crystal. I took a slow sip, keeping my eyes wide and vacant, manufacturing the perfect illusion of a confused, defeated old man coming to terms with his own cognitive decline. I placed the glass back down and let out a long, shaky sigh. "Maybe you are right," I murmured, letting my voice waver slightly. "I have been feeling very tired lately. Sometimes the days just blur together. I do not want to be a burden to you, Derek. I do not want to cause problems for your family." Heather leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with predatory triumph. "You are not a burden, Dad," she cooed, her voice dripping with fake empathy. "We will take care of the transition. Just leave all the complicated paperwork to me." I picked up the glossy brochure with my trembling hand and tucked it into my coat pocket. "I need some time to think about it," I whispered, standing up slowly from the table. "Let me go home and rest. We can talk about the legal steps tomorrow." Derek nodded eagerly, clearly relieved he did not have to argue or face any resistance. I walked out the front door, maintaining my slow, unsteady gait until I reached my car. I climbed inside, shut the heavy door, and locked it. The trembling in my hand vanished instantly. My posture straightened. The confused old man evaporated into the cold November air. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed. The line rang twice before a sharp professional voice answered. Robert Katz speaking. I stared through the windshield at my son's brightly lit house. "Prepare the noose, Robert," I said, my voice like crushed glass. They just kicked the chair. I disconnected the call with Robert Katz and placed my phone on the passenger seat. The interior of my car was pitch black, a sharp contrast to the warm, inviting glow radiating from the windows of my son's house. I sat there for a brief moment, watching the silhouettes of Derek and Heather move across their dining room. They were likely celebrating. They believed they had just successfully manipulated a declining old man into surrendering his freedom. I shifted the car into drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving the illusion of my family behind. I had not driven more than 2 miles when my phone vibrated sharply against the leather upholstery. I glanced at the illuminated screen. The caller ID displayed Brenda's name. I pressed the answer button and routed the call through the vehicle's speakers. Malcolm, Brenda said, her voice crackling with a sharp electric tension. "I need you to come to my office at the contracting yard right now. I just found something that changes the entire timeline." I did not ask questions. I simply confirmed my arrival and turned the steering wheel, altering my route toward the industrial district. The drive took 15 minutes. The commercial yard was deserted, surrounded by high chain-link fences and floodlights that cast long, harsh shadows across the parked heavy machinery. I parked next to Brenda's black SUV and walked up the metal stairs to the main administrative trailer. I pushed the door open. Brenda was sitting behind a large mahogany desk, her face illuminated by the harsh blue glow of a dual monitor setup. She did not bother with pleasantries. She pointed to a small black plastic square resting on her desk. "Gary has a dash cam installed in his primary work truck," Brenda explained, her eyes fixed on the screen. "It is company policy for insurance purposes. It records outward-facing video, but it also captures high-definition audio inside the cab. Gary knows this. He thinks he is a meticulous criminal. When he got home tonight, I noticed he had manually formatted the local memory card on the device. He wiped the hard drive clean. I pulled up a chair and sat across from her. "But you found a way around his deletion," I stated, knowing exactly the kind of woman I was dealing with. Brenda allowed a grim, humorless smile to touch her lips. Gary is a man who builds houses, Malcolm. He does not understand cloud architecture. 2 months ago, I quietly routed all company dashcams to sync directly to an encrypted offshore server the moment the vehicles connect to the yard's wireless network. He wiped the physical card, but the audio had already been backed up to my administrative vault. I recovered the files from this afternoon. I have the entire conversation he had with your daughter-in-law while they were parked behind a commercial strip mall just 3 hours ago. Brenda reached for her mouse and clicked a file on her desktop. Prepare yourself, Malcolm. She does not hold back. The speakers on Brenda's desk crackled to life. The heavy, unmistakable rumble of a diesel engine filled the quiet office. For a few seconds, there was only the sound of traffic passing in the background. Then Heather's voice cut through the static. The sickeningly sweet domestic tone she had used at the dinner table was entirely gone. In its place was a sharp, venomous sneer. I cannot stand looking at that senile old fool for one more second, Heather spat, her voice echoing off the walls of the trailer. Sitting there watching him shake his little glass of water like a pathetic child. It makes my skin crawl. Gary's voice chimed in next, sounding nervous and impatient. Did he buy the nursing home pitch? Did Derek push back at all? I listened intently, keeping my breathing slow and measured. Heather let out a loud, mocking laugh. Derek is a spineless coward. He folded the second I handed him the brochure. He actually thinks he is doing the noble thing by locking his father away. I swear Gary manipulating my husband is like taking candy from a blind toddler. He is so desperate for my approval that he will sign absolutely anything I put in front of him. Brenda glanced at me, watching my reaction. I kept my face carved from stone. I had already grieved the loss of my son. Hearing his wife confirm his absolute pathetic weakness only solidified the resolve in my chest. So what is the exact timeline Gary asked on the recording? I cannot keep sneaking around like this, Heather. My wife is starting to ask questions about the corporate accounts. We need the cash now. Heather sighed, a sharp, irritated sound. Calm down, Gary. The trap is already set. Tomorrow morning I am sitting Derek down. I am going to cry, tell him how stressed I am about his father's medical expenses, and convince him that the only way to secure a spot at that high-end psychiatric facility is to provide a massive upfront retainer. I am going to make Derek take out a $200,000 home equity loan against our house. The heavy silence in Brenda's office felt suffocating. Heather was actively planning to destroy her own household. Gary whistled low on the tape. 200 grand. You think he will actually mortgage his own house for the old man? I know he will, Heather replied with absolute certainty, because I am going to tell him his father's assets are temporarily frozen by the state until the guardianship clears. I will make him believe the loan is just a bridge fund. The second that 200,000 hits our joint checking account, I am wiring it straight to your offshore shell company. I listened to the sheer malice unfolding through the speakers. Heather was engineering a catastrophic financial ruin for my son. We booked the flights to Paris for the end of the week. Heather continued, her voice dripping with greedy anticipation. By the time Derek realizes the money is gone, we will be drinking champagne in Europe. I will leave the divorce papers on the kitchen counter. Derek will be stuck with a foreclosed house, a mountain of debt, and a crazy father locked in a padded room. He will be completely bankrupt, and there is nothing he can do about it. The audio captured the sound of Gary laughing, a low, sleazy sound of approval. You really are a wicked woman, Heather. I stared at the black speakers on Brenda's desk. The meticulous cruelty of her plan was staggering. She did not just want to steal from me. She wanted to obliterate Derek's entire existence as collateral damage. She wanted to leave him destitute, trapped under a crushing mortgage solely to fund her romantic European escape. Brenda paused the recording and looked at me. They are planning to drain your son of every dime he has to his name, she said quietly. I nodded, my expression unyielding. Let her try, I replied. Play the rest of the file. Brenda clicked the mouse again. The static resumed, followed by the sound of a lighter clicking and Gary exhaling a long breath of smoke. The 200 grand is a nice payday, Heather, Gary said, his tone shifting, becoming sharper and far more greedy. But what about the big score? You told me the old man had real money hidden away. You said there was a trust. The rustle of fabric echoed through the speakers as Heather shifted in the passenger seat. I could almost picture the cold, calculated smirk spreading across her face. Oh, the trust is very real, Gary. Heather purred, her voice lowering into a conspiratorial whisper. The old man thinks he is so smart, hiding his wealth in restricted accounts. But he made one fatal mistake. He let me handle his insurance paperwork last year, and I memorized the routing data. The second that old man is officially committed to the psych ward, my forged power of attorney becomes absolute and uncontestable by the bank. I listened, my eyes locking onto Brenda's. Heather chuckled, a dark, chilling sound that vibrated with pure malice. "The home equity loan is just our travel money," Gary Heather stated with absolute terrifying confidence. "Once that old man is locked behind a steel door, my legal access is guaranteed. I am draining his $2.5 million trust before they even serve him dinner." I did not flinch when the audio file finished playing. The revelation of Heather planning to drain a $2.5 million trust was the final piece of the puzzle. I thanked Brenda for the intercept, stood up from the desk, and walked out into the cold night. By 8 o'clock the next morning, I was sitting across from my attorney, Robert Katz, in his downtown office. Robert is a man who operates with surgical precision. When I played the dash cam audio for him, his expression did not change, but his eyes hardened into twin chips of flint. I told Robert we needed to pivot. Heather was accelerating her timeline. We could not just wait for her to attempt the wire fraud. We needed to guarantee she stayed in the city long enough to execute her felony on our terms. We needed a lure so massive she would abandon her immediate escape plan. I instructed Robert to draft a highly realistic, incredibly detailed financial statement. We used official-looking heavy bond paper. We embossed it with the logo of a fictional subsidiary of my actual wealth management firm. The document outlined a restricted, irrevocable trust. At the very bottom of the first page, printed in bold, undeniable ink, was the total available balance, $2,540,000. Robert even added a fabricated legal clause stating that in the event of my medical incapacitation, the designated power of attorney would gain immediate, unchecked liquidity of the entire fund. It was the exact fantasy Heather had described to Gary on the recording. The bait was set. Later that morning, Heather sent me a text offering to come over and help me organize my house. She claimed it was to help me prepare for my transition to the psychiatric facility, but I knew her true motive. She was coming to snoop. She wanted to inventory my assets and search for any loose financial documents before she locked me away. I placed the forged trust statement inside a standard manila folder. I purposely left the folder sitting slightly open on my living room coffee table right next to my reading glasses and a half-empty cup of tea. It looked exactly like the careless mistake of a declining old man. Heather arrived at my house precisely at noon. She wore casual clothes, carrying a box of cleaning supplies and a bright artificial smile. "Dad, I am here to help," she announced, walking through the front door with practiced enthusiasm. "You just sit back and relax. I will handle the dusting and start boxing up the living room for you." I played my part flawlessly. I hunched, my shoulders moved with a slow, shuffling gait, and thanked her in a weak, tired voice. I told her I was feeling particularly exhausted and needed to lie down in my bedroom for a while. I gestured vaguely toward the living room, telling her to just tidy up whatever she saw fit. As I walked down the hallway and closed my bedroom door, I did not go to sleep. I pulled out my tablet. Earlier that morning, I had installed a micro-surveillance camera inside the spine of a hollowed-out hardcover book on my living room shelf. The high-definition feed streamed directly to my device. I sat on the edge of my bed and watched the screen. For the first 10 minutes, Heather kept up the act. She dusted the mantel, straightened the throw pillows, and hummed a cheerful tune. But the moment she was certain I was out of earshot, the domestic facade instantly evaporated. Her posture stiffened. She dropped the dusting cloth onto a chair and began systematically searching my space. She opened drawers, checked under the sofa cushions, and rifled through the mail stack on the entryway console. Then she saw the manila folder resting on the coffee table. She approached it cautiously, like a predator spotting an unguarded carcass. She nudged the cover open with one perfectly manicured finger. The hidden camera captured her face in sharp detail. I watched as her eyes darted to the top of the document, scanning the letterhead. Then her gaze dropped to the bold number at the bottom of the page, $2.5 million. The physical transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. Her breathing hitched. Her eyes widened so far I could see the whites all the way around her pupils. Her hands began to shake violently. Greed is not just an emotion. It is a physiological response. It overrides logic, common sense, and caution. Heather was staring at a piece of paper that confirmed her wildest, most arrogant fantasies. She brought a hand to her chest, physically overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the number in front of her. She looked wildly over her shoulder toward the hallway to ensure my bedroom door was still shut. Satisfied she was alone, she reached into her back pocket and pulled out her smartphone. Her hands were trembling so severely she almost dropped the device. She opened her camera application. She leaned directly over the coffee table, snapping photo after photo of the forged document. She made sure to capture the account numbers, the fabricated routing details, and the medical incapacitation clause Robert Katz had so brilliantly included. She flipped to the second page and photographed that as well. She was utterly consumed by the trap. She carefully slid the papers back into the manila folder, arranging it exactly as she had found it. She picked up her dusting cloth, but her chest was heaving with adrenaline. She had swallowed the hook completely. 10 minutes later, I heard a sharp knock on my bedroom door. Heather called out, her voice pitching an octave higher than usual, vibrating with poorly concealed urgency. "Dad, I am so sorry, but Derek just called. There is an emergency with his business accounts, and I have to go help him sort it out. I will come back and finish cleaning later." I opened the door, maintaining my confused, docile expression. I nodded slowly and told her not to worry about me. She practically ran out the front door, slamming it behind her. The moment the lock clicked, my phone vibrated in my pocket. The timing was absolute perfection. I answered the call. Brenda was on the other end, her voice radiating a dark, triumphant satisfaction. "Malcolm, we got her." Brenda stated, the sound of her rapid typing echoing in the background. "I have Gary's primary messaging application synced to my administrative dashboard. Your daughter-in-law just sent him a frantic text message less than 60 seconds ago." I walked into the living room, picked up the manila folder from the coffee table, and smiled. "Read it to me, Brenda. I want to hear exactly what she wrote." Brenda cleared her throat and read the intercepted text message word for word. "Cancel the flights to Paris for tomorrow. Do not argue with me. The old man actually has $2.5 million sitting in a restricted trust. I just found the paperwork on his table. I need one more week to get it all. I will force Derek to sign the home equity loan today, but we are not leaving until I drain the big account." The trap had snapped shut with bone-breaking force. Heather had completely abandoned her original escape plan. The prospect of fleeing with Derek's $200,000 was no longer enough for her. The sheer gravitational pull of the $2.5 million had anchored her right where I needed her. She was going to stay. She was going to execute the fraudulent loan, and she was going to attempt to breach my accounts. She was walking directly into federal jurisdiction, completely blinded by her own avarice. I thanked Brenda and hung up the phone. I stood in the quiet of my living room, holding the forged trust document in my hands. The chessboard was locked. The queen was cornered, and she had no idea the game was already over. The very next morning, the gears of Heather's new strategy began to turn. I did not have to guess how she would execute the mortgage scheme. Brenda forwarded me a string of intercepted text messages and forwarded emails between Heather and a private mortgage broker. Heather had completely shifted her narrative with Derek. She was no longer simply suggesting a nursing home. She had manufactured an urgent financial crisis to panic my son. I read the transcript of an audio message she had sent to Gary, gloating about her manipulation. She told Derek that the psychiatric facility required a massive upfront deposit to secure my immediate placement before my condition worsened. She claimed my assets were legally locked in a mandatory probate evaluation because of my supposed cognitive decline, meaning they needed liquid cash immediately. She laid on the guilt, weeping to Derek about how dangerous it was for me to be alone, and how they would eventually be reimbursed once my accounts were unfrozen. She pressed a home equity loan application into his hands that very night. Derek, crippled by his own business debts and desperate to please a wife who openly despised him, signed the paperwork without requesting a single point of clarification from an independent lawyer. He leveraged the entire equity of his suburban house, the only real asset he had to his name, for exactly $200,000. Heather structured the loan payout to drop directly into an external joint checking account she controlled. It was a masterclass in domestic manipulation. She had engineered a scenario where my son was willingly bankrupting himself, believing he was performing an act of ultimate filial duty. I sat in my kitchen reviewing the digital copies Brenda had secured. The approval process for the equity loan was expedited, pushed through by a broker who asked 0 questions. The money was scheduled to clear within 48 hours. I had one final obligation to fulfill before the hammer fell. I had to look my son in the eyes one last time. I called Derek and asked him to meet me at a small coffee shop near the old steel mill. It was a place we used to visit when he was a teenager, a place grounded in reality, far away from the polished suburban illusion he lived in. He arrived 20 minutes late, checking his expensive watch, his face tight with irritation. He sat down across from me without taking off his coat. I looked at the man I had raised. I decided to offer him one final unobstructed exit from the burning building. I pushed a cup of black coffee across the table toward him. "You look stressed, son," I said, keeping my voice low and completely lucid. "I know your supply business has been struggling. I know the commercial loans are weighing heavily on you. If you are in financial trouble, you can tell me. I have resources you do not know about. I can help you clear your debts today, but you have to be honest with me." Derek scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed in the quiet cafe. He leaned back, crossing his arms, looking at me with a mixture of pity and arrogant frustration. "Dad, stop. You do not have the resources to bail out a commercial supply chain. You worked in a mill your whole life. And honestly, it is getting hard to listen to these delusions of grandeur. You are not thinking clearly anymore." I kept my hands perfectly still on the table. "Are you entirely sure about that, Derek?" I asked, offering him the absolute last lifeline. "Are you certain the decisions you are making right now, the documents you are signing, are in your best interest? Is Heather truly acting in your best interest?" His eyes flared with sudden defensive anger. "Do not bring Heather into this," he snapped, pointing a finger at me. "She is holding my entire life together while you are busy losing your grip on reality. She is coordinating your medical care because you cannot even remember to manage your own bank accounts. She is the only reason we are surviving right now." I stared at him. He was violently defending the woman who was currently stealing his home to finance her escape with a contractor. I took a slow breath. "You are mortgaging your house, Derek. You are leveraging your only asset for a psychiatric facility I do not need. If you sign those final closing papers, there is no turning back. You will lose everything." Derek stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I am doing what needs to be done because you are too sick to understand it. I am handling the finances because you cannot. Heather and I have it under control. Do not call me down here again for another one of your paranoid episodes." He turned his back on me and walked out of the coffee shop. I watched him get into his car and drive away. The bridge was officially burned to ash. I felt no sorrow. I felt no regret. I had extended my hand and he had spat on it. From this exact second forward, Derek was no longer my son. He was simply collateral damage in a war he was too arrogant to see. The following afternoon, the trap absorbed its first major impact. I was sitting in my living room when my phone lit up with an incoming call from Brenda. I answered, and her voice practically hummed with dark, predatory satisfaction. "The home equity loan just cleared," Brenda announced, the sound of her rapid typing serving as a drumbeat in the background. $200,000 was deposited into Derek and Heather's joint account at 9 o'clock this morning. Heather wasted absolutely no time. She did not keep the money there for even a full hour. I listened intently, calculating the precise legal violations stacking up against my daughter-in-law. "Where did she send it?" I asked. "She initiated a wire transfer of exactly $150,000 directly into Gary's corporate contracting account," Brenda replied. "She labeled it as a non-refundable materials deposit for a major residential build. She kept $50,000 in her own account for immediate travel expenses. She thinks she just secured their getaway fund." A cold smile spread across my face. "And the current status of that corporate account?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Brenda let out a sharp, victorious laugh. "Gary's corporate accounts have been under a hard administrative freeze since yesterday evening. I locked him out of every single ledger, canceled his debit cards, and revoked his digital access. Heather's wire transfer hit the account, but it is trapped behind a firewall only I control. He cannot withdraw a single cent. Heather had successfully bankrupted my son, but the stolen money was now sitting in a vault guarded by the very woman whose marriage she had destroyed. The funds were locked, the escape route was dead, and the contractor was about to realize he was completely paralyzed. Gary stood at the teller counter of the commercial bank branch downtown. Brenda sent me the security stills later that evening, painting a pathetic picture of a man realizing his escape hatch was permanently welded shut. He had walked into the bank wearing his usual heavy boots and work jacket, carrying a large duffel bag he fully intended to stuff with $150,000 in untraceable cash. He approached the teller with his corporate debit card, demanding an immediate offshore wire transfer and a maximum physical cash withdrawal. The teller swiped his card. The system prompted a hard stop. Gary assumed it was a simple daily limit error. He aggressively demanded to speak to the branch manager. The manager stepped out of his glass office, looked at the computer screen, and informed Gary that his corporate profile lacked the administrative credentials to move a single dollar. Gary argued. He shouted that he was the co-owner of the business. The manager calmly explained that the primary financial officer had executed a complete digital lockdown on all corporate assets pending an internal audit. Gary's access was entirely revoked. He was essentially a ghost in his own company. The dashcam audio from his truck captured the exact moment his arrogance shattered into pure, unadulterated panic. Brenda forwarded me the recording. Gary slammed the door of his pickup truck, his breathing heavy and erratic. He punched the steering wheel, screaming profanities into the empty cabin. He pulled out his phone and tried to log into his mobile banking application. Access denied. He tried his secondary credit cards. Access denied. Every financial artery had been cleanly severed. He was sitting on top of the massive sum Heather had just stolen from my son, yet he could not touch a single penny of it. The money was trapped in a digital vault and Brenda held the only key. He threw his phone against the passenger seat, shifted the truck into drive, and sped out of the bank parking lot. He drove erratically through the city streets, running yellow lights, his mind undoubtedly spinning with terrifying realizations. He was out of time, out of money, and about to face the woman who controlled his entire existence. He stormed into his house, kicking the front door shut, ready to demand answers. He expected to find a typical administrative error or a misunderstanding. He had no idea he was walking straight into a firing squad. Brenda was sitting at her pristine marble kitchen island. A freshly brewed cup of chamomile tea rested in her hands. The house was immaculately clean, quiet, and cold. When Gary burst through the hallway, his face flushed red with rage, he immediately started yelling. He demanded to know why the bank had locked him out, shouting about rogue algorithms and banking errors. Brenda did not flinch. She did not raise her voice to match his frantic energy. She simply took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea, set the porcelain cup down, and reached for a thick, heavy manila folder resting beside her. She slid the folder across the smooth marble surface. It stopped exactly in front of him. Gary paused, his rant dying in his throat. He looked at the folder, then back at his wife. "Open it," Brenda commanded, her voice slicing through the room with surgical precision. Gary hesitated, a sudden primal fear overriding his anger. He reached out with trembling fingers and flipped the cover open. The first thing he saw was a high-resolution photograph of himself and Heather completely naked, tangled together on the hardwood floor of my mountain cabin. Underneath that photo was another, the two of them kissing on the balcony of the downtown hotel. Below that was a printed transcript of their dashcam conversations outlining their entire plan to flee to Europe with stolen money. The blood drained from Gary's face so fast he looked like a corpse. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords refused to produce a single sound. He staggered backward, hitting the edge of the refrigerator, his eyes wide with absolute horror. Brenda did not give him a second to formulate a lie. She pulled a secondary stack of legal documents from her handbag and dropped them onto the island. The pages hit the marble with a heavy final thud. "Those are divorce papers," Brenda stated, her tone entirely devoid of sorrow or hesitation. "I filed them this morning. You will notice the highlight on page 4. We signed an ironclad prenuptial agreement 7 years ago, Gary. It included a zero-asset infidelity clause. If either party was proven to have committed adultery, they forfeit all claims to corporate equity, joint savings, and marital properties. You broke the contract. Therefore, you get absolutely nothing. You do not own a share of the business. You do not own this house. You do not even own the truck sitting in the driveway." Gary's knees buckled. He grabbed the edge of the counter to keep from collapsing onto the floor. "Brenda, please," he gasped, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate whine. "I can explain." It meant nothing. "She manipulated me." Brenda stood up from the stool. Her posture was magnificent, the embodiment of a woman reclaiming her absolute power. "There is no explanation, Gary. The $150,000 your little girlfriend wired to our corporate account this morning has been permanently seized. I have already flagged it as a fraudulent deposit. You are completely bankrupt. You have 20 minutes to pack a single bag of your personal clothing and walk out my front door. If you are not off my property when that timer goes off, I will call the police and have you arrested for trespassing. And if you ever try to contact me again, I will personally send these photographs to every single general contractor, supplier, and client in this state. You will never swing a hammer in this industry again." She turned her back on him, picked up her tea, and walked out of the kitchen, leaving him utterly destroyed in the silent house. Gary was thrown out into the freezing November air with nothing but a duffel bag and a dying cell phone. He did not call a friend. He did not call a lawyer. He immediately called the only person left to blame. Brenda forwarded me the audio recording of the phone call 5 minutes after he made it. He was pacing wildly behind a gas station down the street from his former home. When Heather answered, she was cheerful, likely expecting to hear that their European getaway funds were secure. Gary did not say hello. He screamed into the receiver with the unhinged panic of a trapped animal. "Heather, it is gone. Everything is gone. Brenda knows everything. She has pictures of us at the cabin. She locked the bank accounts and threw me out on the street." Heather went dead silent on the line. Then she let out a frantic, high-pitched gasp. "What do you mean she knows?" "Gary, the money is in your account. Just withdraw the cash. I cannot touch it." "Heather," Gary roared, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I have $0. My wife took my business, my house, and my truck. We have no escape fund. You need to get that old man's $2.5 million trust fund right now. I do not care how you do it." Heather began to panic, stammering about needing more time to arrange the forgery. "We do not have time," Gary screamed, completely losing his mind. "I am freezing on the street with nothing. You secure that money by tomorrow morning, Heather. Do you hear me? By tomorrow morning. If you do not have that $2.5 million in a new untraceable account by tomorrow, I am driving straight to your house. I will show Derek every single photo and tell him exactly how you stole his mortgage. Get the money, or I burn you down with me." Heather dropped her phone onto the kitchen counter. Gary's desperate screams still echoed in her ears. She paced the length of the marble floor, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The comfortable, meticulously planned timeline she had constructed was completely destroyed. She could no longer wait for the slow, bureaucratic wheels of the family court system to declare me mentally incompetent. That process could take weeks, maybe months, and Gary had given her until tomorrow morning. If she did not secure the $2.5 million immediately, Gary would drive straight to Derek. He would show her husband the photographs, play the recordings, and expose the entire fraudulent mortgage scheme. She would lose the house, the money, and her freedom. She was out of time. Panic is a powerful catalyst for terrible decisions. Heather rushed to her home office, booted up her encrypted laptop, and began searching for a solution. She knew she needed legal authorization to breach a restricted trust of that magnitude. A simple forged signature on a bank withdrawal slip would not bypass the security protocols of a major wealth management firm. She needed a fully notarized, legally binding power of attorney that explicitly granted her immediate liquidity of my assets. But no legitimate notary public in the state would ever stamp a document transferring millions of dollars without the principal signatory present in the room. She needed a criminal. She navigated through a series of shadowy online forums and local underground message boards she had discovered years ago when helping a former employer hide assets. Within an hour, she found what she was looking for: a broker operating out of a dilapidated strip mall on the outskirts of the city. He advertised himself as an independent legal consultant who specialized in expedited documentation with no questions asked. For a premium fee of $10,000 in cash, he guaranteed a fully certified backdated notary stamp on any document presented to him. Heather did not hesitate. She raided her personal emergency safe, emptying the last of her hidden cash reserves, and sent a secure message to set the appointment for 2:00 that afternoon. She printed the fabricated trust access forms and carefully forged my signature, tracing the letters over and over until they perfectly matched the documents I had supposedly signed in the past. She placed the fraudulent paperwork into a sleek leather portfolio. She checked her reflection in the mirror, fixing her makeup and smoothing her hair. She convinced herself she was untouchable. She grabbed her car keys and walked out the door, fully believing she was about to secure her financial independence. She had absolutely no idea she was driving straight into a federal snare. While Heather was speeding down the highway toward the outskirts of the city, I was sitting in a windowless surveillance van parked discreetly behind an abandoned warehouse. Attorney Robert Katz sat beside me, his eyes fixed on a bank of high-definition monitors. We were not alone. 3 special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation occupied the remaining seats, adjusting audio dials and calibrating video feeds. Robert leaned back in his chair and handed me a cup of black coffee. He explained the architecture of the trap we had laid. When Heather initiated her search for a black market notary, she stepped into an ecosystem heavily monitored by federal authorities. The underground broker she contacted did not actually exist. The online profile, the encrypted messaging board, and the strip mall office were all components of an active FBI sting operation designed to catch white-collar criminals attempting to launder money and forge federal documents. The man waiting for her inside that office was a seasoned undercover federal agent. Robert had coordinated with the task force the moment we established the $2.5 million bait. We knew Heather's greed would eventually force her to bypass the legal system. The room Heather was about to enter was rigged with state-of-the-art surveillance technology. Tiny, imperceptible cameras were embedded in the smoke detectors, the wall clock, and the desk lamp. High-fidelity microphones were hidden beneath the desk and inside the ventilation grates. Every single word she spoke, every micro-expression on her face, and every movement of her hands would be captured from 4 different angles and transmitted directly to the servers at federal headquarters. We watched the primary monitor as a sleek silver sedan pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of the strip mall. Heather stepped out of the vehicle, clutching her leather portfolio tightly to her chest. She looked around nervously, her eyes darting left and right, ensuring no one was watching her enter the rundown building. She pushed open the glass door and stepped into the dimly lit reception area. The undercover agent sat behind a cheap laminate desk wearing a wrinkled suit and a bored expression. He played his part flawlessly. He did not greet her with warmth. He simply asked for the cash up front. Heather opened her purse and pulled out the thick envelope of $100 bills. She placed it on the desk. The agent counted the money slowly, deliberately dragging out the silence to let her anxiety peak. Satisfied, he tossed the envelope into a drawer and gestured for her to produce the documents. Heather unzipped her portfolio and slid the forged power of attorney and the trust access forms across the desk. The agent reviewed the papers, his eyes scanning the fabricated legal clauses Robert had so carefully drafted. He tapped his pen against the desk, leaning forward to look Heather directly in the eyes. "This is a massive asset transfer," he said, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial whisper. "The Federal Banking Commission flags trusts over $1 million. If this signature is not authentic, the bank will freeze the funds and trigger an automatic federal fraud investigation. If I stamp this, my name is on it. I need to know that this old man is not going to walk into a police station tomorrow and claim someone stole his life savings." The warning was explicit. The agent was giving her a clear, undeniable opportunity to walk away. He was establishing premeditation on the federal record. Heather did not even blink. She leaned closer to the desk, her face hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated arrogance. "The old man is a vegetable," Heather stated coldly, her voice echoing with crystal clarity through the surveillance speakers in our van. "He is currently sitting in a chair staring at a wall. By tomorrow morning, he will be locked in a secure psychiatric facility with a dementia diagnosis. He does not even know what day it is, let alone how much money he has. He is never going to walk into a police station. Just stamp the document." The undercover agent held her gaze for a long moment, ensuring the cameras captured her complete lack of remorse. He nodded slowly. He picked up his heavy brass notary seal. He positioned it over the bottom of the fabricated trust document and pressed down firmly. The sharp mechanical click of the stamp echoed through the silent room. He signed his alias over the seal and slid the paperwork back across the desk. Heather snatched the documents with trembling hands. She stared at the embossed seal, her breathing heavy with adrenaline. The trap had snapped shut with absolute finality. The moment she took possession of that stamped forgery, she cemented her guilt. She had engaged in a conspiracy to commit wire fraud, identity theft, and federal forgery. She carefully placed the documents back into her leather portfolio and zipped it shut. She stood up, her posture instantly transforming from nervous desperation to victorious pride. She offered the undercover agent a brilliant, triumphant smile, entirely unaware that the man across from her had just handed her a one-way ticket to federal prison. She turned and walked out of the office, the bell on the door ringing cheerfully behind her. I watched her stride confidently back to her car on the surveillance monitor. She truly believed she had won. She believed she had outsmarted me, bankrupted my son, and secured her luxurious future. She had no idea the real execution was just beginning. Heather returned to my son's house that afternoon with the leather portfolio clutched tightly in her grip. I observed her arrival through the hidden camera I had previously placed in their living room. She was practically vibrating with a manic, victorious energy. She had secured what she believed was the ultimate weapon, a federally certified black market key to a $2.5 million fortune. To mask her true intentions and manage Derek's crushing guilt over the $200,000 loan, she orchestrated a grand, grotesque distraction. She decided to host an early Thanksgiving dinner. She called it a special family gathering to honor me before my supposedly inevitable transition to the psychiatric care facility. She spent the afternoon cooking, arranging centerpieces, and lighting expensive candles. The dining room was transformed into a pristine magazine-worthy holiday spread. When I arrived at 6 o'clock, the contrast between the festive decorations and the suffocating tension in the room was palpable. Derek sat near the fireplace, clutching a glass of bourbon, looking like a man marching to the gallows. He had mortgaged his entire future to appease the woman bustling around the kitchen. Heather greeted me at the door wearing a dark burgundy dress and an apron, her smile so bright and artificial it looked painful. She guided me to the head of the table, treating me with the exaggerated slow caution one might use for a fragile glass ornament. I played my part flawlessly. I let my shoulders slump, offered a weak, confused smile, and stared blankly at the roasted turkey in the center of the table. I moved with deliberate slowness, projecting the image of a defeated man completely detached from reality. Heather poured the wine, her hands steady, her eyes gleaming with predatory excitement. She firmly believed this was her final performance. She thought she was serving me a last supper before locking me away and fleeing across the Atlantic. She had no idea the house was entirely surrounded by invisible tripwires. Every smile she offered, every domestic chore she performed was simply a layer of icing on a poisoned cake. I unfolded my napkin and placed it on my lap. I was perfectly content to let her serve me. The dinner proceeded in a heavy, agonizing quiet, broken only by the clinking of silverware against fine china. Derek barely touched his food. He stared at his plate, swallowed by the crushing reality of his massive debt. Heather, however, was in her element. She ate with an enthusiastic appetite, filling the silence with cheerful, empty chatter about the changing seasons and neighborhood gossip. I cut my steak with slow, deliberate precision. I chewed my food, my face a mask of mild, elderly confusion, while my mind tracked the precise timeline of the federal task force waiting in the wings. Halfway through the meal, Heather stood up. She picked up her crystal wine glass and tapped it gently with her knife. The sharp ringing sound commanded the room. Derek flinched. I slowly lifted my head, offering her my vacant practice stare. Heather cleared her throat and let a perfectly manufactured sheen of tears pool in her eyes. "I want to make a toast," Heather began, her voice quivering with a sickeningly sweet theatrical emotion. "This is a very special evening for us. Family is the most important thing in the world, and sometimes loving your family means making the hardest decisions imaginable." She looked down at Derek, offering him a look of profound, manipulative pity. "Derek, my wonderful husband, you have carried such a heavy burden lately. You have sacrificed so much to ensure your father gets the round-the-clock medical care he desperately needs. I know how much it hurts you, but you are doing the noble thing. You are a good son." Derek squeezed his eyes shut and took a long, desperate swallow of his bourbon. He could not even look in my direction. Heather turned her gaze to me, her eyes shining with fake angelic compassion. "And Dad," she cooed, her tone shifting to the patronizing cadence one uses with a toddler. "We love you so much. We want to honor everything you built. I know things have been confusing for you lately. I know the memory lapses are scary, but you do not have to worry about anything anymore. I am going to take over all the complicated paperwork. I am going to shoulder the financial stress so you can just rest. You are safe with us, Dad. We are going to protect your legacy." I sat in dead silence. I did not blink. I did not nod. I simply placed a piece of steak into my mouth and chewed slowly. My eyes locked directly onto hers. I let the silence stretch. I let the uncomfortable, heavy weight of my unbroken stare fill the dining room. Heather expected me to offer a confused smile or a weak word of gratitude. I gave her absolutely nothing. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A tiny flicker of unease crossed her features, but her immense arrogance quickly buried it. She raised her glass higher, attempting to recover the momentum of her grand monologue. To family, she declared, her voice ringing hollow in the suffocating room. And to fresh starts. She took a long sip of her wine and sat back down, visibly thrilled with her own performance. She had delivered her final deceit. She had justified her theft, validated my son's cowardice, and mentally finalized her escape plan. I swallowed my food, wiped my mouth carefully with the linen napkin, and picked up my water glass. I knew the truth. I knew the notary was a federal agent. I knew her $200,000 mortgage theft was sitting frozen in a locked corporate account. She was a rat, proudly decorating her own cage, and I was merely waiting for the steel door to drop. While Heather was basking in the glow of her fraudulent victory inside the dining room, a completely different reality was unfolding just beyond the property line. Parked 2 blocks away, hidden in the shadows of a large oak tree, sat Gary in his heavy-duty Ford pickup truck. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his breathing shallow and erratic. The truck engine was idling, releasing a low, steady rumble into the freezing November air. He was a man completely out of options. Brenda had stripped him of his business, his home, and his dignity. He was banking his entire survival on Heather emerging from that house with a confirmed transfer of $2.5 million. He checked the digital clock on his dashboard for the 5th time. She was supposed to text him the moment the dinner wrapped up. He wiped a bead of cold sweat from his forehead, staring down the dark, quiet suburban street. He shifted the truck into drive, keeping his foot firmly on the brake, ready to speed away the second Heather jumped into the passenger seat. Suddenly, a pair of blinding high-intensity LED headlights flooded his rearview mirror. Gary flinched, throwing a hand up to shield his eyes from the glare. A sleek, heavy black SUV had turned onto the street without any headlights on, moving like a phantom until it was directly behind his bumper. The SUV accelerated sharply and slammed to a halt, boxing his truck in completely against the curb. Gary threw his truck into reverse panic, surging through his chest, but there was no room to maneuver. The driver's side door of the black SUV swung open. A tall, sharp silhouette stepped out into the freezing night. Brenda walked slowly into the blinding beam of the headlights, holding a thick manila envelope in her right hand. Inside the dining room, the suffocating atmosphere grew thicker with every passing second. Heather sat back down, clearly expecting her grand toast to mark the end of the evening conversation. I placed my fork down, letting the metal clink sharply against the porcelain plate. I turned my attention entirely to my son. "Derek," I said, maintaining the slow, deliberate cadence of a confused man, but sharpening the focus of my words. "I was looking over some old banking pamphlets today, trying to get my affairs in order. It made me think about your house. I know the commercial real estate market is volatile right now. If you needed capital to secure my medical deposit, what kind of leverage did you use?" Derek shifted uncomfortably in his chair, running a hand over the back of his neck. A bead of sweat formed at his temple. "A standard home equity line, Dad," he mumbled, refusing to meet my eyes. "It is nothing you need to stress over." I leaned forward slightly. "Did you secure a fixed rate or an adjustable margin?" I asked, my voice polite but relentlessly specific. "And the dispersal timeline. Banks usually mandate a standard holding period for equity payouts. To bypass that and secure a $200,000 wire transfer so quickly, you must have agreed to a brutal early repayment penalty." Derek swallowed hard. His face flushed a deep, panicked crimson. He had no idea what the terms of his own loan were. He had blindly signed the paperwork Heather placed in front of him. Heather immediately intervened, slamming her wine glass onto the table. "Dad, please," she scolded, injecting a heavy dose of fake maternal patience into her tone. "We agreed not to talk about stressful financial logistics tonight. This dinner is about celebrating family and focusing on your health. You are getting yourself worked up over numbers you do not need to understand anymore. Derek and I have everything completely under control." I kept my gaze locked on Derek, ignoring her completely. "Are you sure you control the funds, son?" I asked. "Or did you just sign away your only asset to an external account without reading the final closing disclosures?" Derek opened his mouth to reply, his breathing shallow and rapid. His panic was entirely visible. Suddenly, the sharp, demanding chime of the front doorbell echoed through the house. The doorbell shattered the heavy tension hanging over the dining table. Heather leaped out of her chair. Her expression transformed instantly from stern annoyance into a mask of pure triumph. She smoothed the front of her burgundy dress and let out a dramatic, sorrowful sigh that was entirely for my son's benefit. "Derek," she said, her voice trembling with manufactured grief, "I know this is incredibly difficult for you, but we both agreed this was for the best. I did not want to prolong his suffering or give him any unnecessary anxiety, so I arranged for the medical transport team to arrive tonight. They are here to take him to the psychiatric facility." Derek stared at her, his eyes wide and completely horrified. Tonight, he stammered, gripping the edge of the dining table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. "You told me the intake process was not scheduled until Monday morning. You said we had the entire weekend to help him pack his belongings and prepare him for the transition. I am his son. I cannot hand him over to a transport crew in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner." Heather walked over to him and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. Her touch was gentle, but her eyes were cold and commanding. "Derek, sweetheart, We talked about this with the doctors. She lied flawlessly, weaving her final deception into the fabric of his guilt. The facility administrators highly recommended an unannounced immediate transfer. They warned us that if we gave him too much time to process the move, his paranoia would trigger a severe cognitive episode. He might try to run away or hurt himself. I did this to protect him, Derek. I did this to protect us. It is time to let the professionals take over. I remained perfectly seated at the head of the table. I did not raise my voice and I did not attempt to stand up. I simply watched the masterful manipulation unfold. Heather was banking on my supposed confusion to keep me docile while she executed her grand finale. She wanted Derek to be the one to physically walk to the door and sign me away. She wanted to cement his compliance, forcing him to take the final irrevocable step in betraying his own father. Derek looked from Heather to me, his chest heaving with deep, ragged breaths. "Dad, I am so sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of his own cowardly choices. "I really thought we had more time. But Heather is right. Your mind is failing and we cannot provide the level of care you need. You have to understand that we are doing this because we love you. We just want you to be safe." Heather offered him a brave, encouraging nod. "Go answer the door, Derek," she urged softly. "The transport team is expecting you to sign the preliminary intake forms. Just sign the paperwork and they will handle the rest. I promise everything will be completely fine by tomorrow morning." Derek slowly pushed his chair back from the table. He stood up on shaking legs, moving with the heavy, reluctant gait of a condemned man. He refused to look at me again. He turned his back on his father and walked down the short hallway toward the front entrance of the house. Heather remained standing by the dining table. The moment Derek was out of sight, she turned her gaze to me. The sorrowful daughter-in-law vanished. A cold, victorious smirk spread across her face. "Enjoy the ward, old man," she whispered. Derek slowly approached the front door with his heavy head bowed, thoroughly beaten by his own terrible, cowardly choices. He reached out with a trembling hand and turned the deadbolt, expecting to find 2 orderlies in medical scrubs waiting on the porch with a clipboard and a wheelchair. He pulled the heavy wooden door open. The freezing night air swept into the warm entryway, but there was no medical transport team standing on the welcome mat. Instead, a tall, impeccably dressed woman stood under the porch light. It was Brenda. She wore a sharp, tailored black coat, her rigid posture radiating an absolute, terrifying authority that immediately commanded the entire space. She did not look like a woman who had just trapped a cheating contractor in his truck down the street. She looked exactly like a cold, calculated executioner arriving to deliver a final, devastating verdict. Derek blinked, utterly bewildered by the sight of the unfamiliar woman standing on his porch. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Are you with the psychiatric facility?" My wife said the transport team was scheduled to arrive tonight. Brenda did not offer a polite greeting. She did not smile, and she certainly did not introduce herself. Her eyes bypassed Derek, entirely locking onto the brightly lit dining room situated just down the hallway. She took a deliberate step forward, crossing the threshold into the house without waiting for an invitation. Tucked securely under her left arm was a thick, heavy manila envelope. The exact same envelope containing the high-definition, undeniable photographic evidence of Gary and Heather inside my mountain cabin. Derek instinctively took a quick step back, completely overwhelmed by the sheer, undeniable force of her commanding presence. "Who are you?" Derek demanded, his confusion rapidly morphing into genuine alarm. Brenda finally looked at him. "I am the woman who owns the truck parked down your street," she stated coldly. "And I am here tonight to deliver a very special, unforgettable holiday gift to your cheating wife." Brenda did not wait for my son to process her words. She stepped forward, using her shoulder to firmly push Derek aside with the undeniable force of a woman on a mission. Her heavy black boots clicked aggressively against the hardwood floor as she marched directly down the hallway and into the brightly lit dining room. I remained perfectly still at the head of the table, my hands resting calmly on the arms of my chair. Heather was still standing near the roasted turkey. The victorious, condescending smirk she wore just seconds ago instantly melted from her face, replaced by a rigid mask of absolute shock. She had prepared herself to greet medical transport orderlies. She had no contingency plan for the sharp, formidable woman currently invading her pristine sanctuary. "Who are you?" Heather demanded, her voice shrill and defensive. "Get out of my house right now before I call the police." Brenda did not answer her. She did not even blink. She walked right up to the edge of the polished mahogany dining table. She raised her right hand and violently slammed the thick manila envelope onto the table. The impact sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. The force of the throw burst the metal clasp open. Dozens of high-definition glossy photographs erupted from the envelope. They slid rapidly across the smooth wood, knocking over a crystal wine glass and scattering directly next to the Thanksgiving turkey. The images were utterly inescapable. They were vibrant, perfectly lit, and violently explicit. Several 8x10 prints settled face up right in front of where Derek was now standing. The photographs displayed Heather and Gary completely naked, tangled together on the floor of my mountain cabin. Other photos showed them sharing an intimate, passionate kiss on the balcony of the downtown hotel. The final prints were zoomed-in shots of their faces, their expressions twisted in forbidden pleasure. There was no ambiguity. There was no shadow of a doubt. The visual evidence of her grotesque betrayal was currently soaking up the spilled red wine on her perfectly set holiday table. Brenda stood tall, her eyes locked onto Heather with the terrifying calm of a predator that had successfully cornered its prey. "Merry Thanksgiving," Brenda said, her voice dripping with lethal precision. "I believe you left your dignity in my husband's truck." Derek stumbled into the dining room, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked down at the table, his eyes locked onto the glossy prints scattered across the fine china. For a long, agonizing moment, his brain simply refused to process the visual data. He stared at the images of his wife wrapped in the arms of the contractor he had personally hired. Total paralysis gripped his body. His hands hung limply at his sides. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow shell of a man. His entire reality, the foundation of his marriage, and the immense debt he had just taken on to please this woman, all crashed down around him in real time. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Heather reacted with the desperate, frantic speed of a cornered animal. She lunged forward, her hands scrambling wildly across the mahogany table. She began snatching the photographs, grabbing them by the handful, trying to flip them face down or crush them against her chest. Her perfectly manicured nails scratched desperately against the wood. "Stop looking at them, Derek," she shrieked, her voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated panic. "Do not look at those. They are fake. It is a lie." She threw the crumpled photos onto the floor and rushed over to Derek. She grabbed his arm, digging her fingers into his shirt. "Derek, listen to me," she begged, tears of absolute terror streaming down her face. "Look at me, Derek. That is not me. This woman is sick. She is a deranged stalker. She must be trying to extort us for money. She took photos of me from social media and photoshopped my face onto someone else. It is artificial intelligence. It is a deep fake scam. You have to believe me." Derek did not look at her. He slowly pulled his arm out of her frantic grip. He bent down and picked up one of the crumpled photographs from the floor. He stared at it. The image was incredibly sharp. It captured a very specific, unique birthmark on the back of Heather's left shoulder. It also clearly displayed the custom stone fireplace of my mountain cabin in the background. A stranger orchestrating a random extortion scam would not have access to the interior layout of a private, remote family property. Derek knew this. The cognitive dissonance was tearing his mind apart. He looked up at Brenda, his voice a broken, hollow rasp. "Who is that man?" Brenda did not flinch. "That man is Gary," she stated with absolute clarity. "He is the contractor you hired to fix the cabin. He is also my husband, or rather my soon-to-be ex-husband. And while you were busy signing a $200,000 mortgage today, your wife was busy wiring $150,000 of your money into his corporate account so they could flee to Paris tomorrow." Heather let out a blood-curdling scream. "Shut up!" she roared, pointing a trembling finger at Brenda. "You are a lying psychopath. I am calling the police. I am having you arrested for breaking and entering." "Derek, call the police right now. Throw this crazy woman out of our house." She frantically backed away from the table, hyperventilating, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape hatch. She was a master manipulator, but her sweet domestic facade was entirely shattered. She was drowning in the undeniable truth of her own filth, and she was dragging my son down with her. I had remained completely silent throughout the entire explosive confrontation. I sat at the head of the table, perfectly still, watching the destruction of the woman who had tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward. The chaos swirled around me, a hurricane of screams, denial, and shattered illusions. I picked up my silver fork and calmly finished the last piece of steak on my plate. I chewed slowly, savoring the profound, absolute victory of the moment. I placed the silverware down, the soft clink cutting through Heather's hysterical sobbing. I reached for my linen napkin. I deliberately unfolded it and carefully wiped the corners of my mouth. Every eye in the dining room suddenly snapped toward me. The slow, methodical nature of my movements commanded their complete attention. The illusion of the frail, confused old man vanished instantly. My posture straightened. The cold, unyielding authority of a man who had commanded thousands of steelworkers radiated from my frame. I placed the napkin gently on the table. I locked my eyes directly onto Heather. The sheer terror I saw reflecting in her pupils was deeply satisfying. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, lethal certainty that completely silenced the room. "They are not fake, Heather." I said, my words striking her like physical blows. "I took the license plate photo myself 4 weeks ago, right when you were working late." The room plunged into an absolute suffocating silence. Derek stood frozen, his eyes darting frantically from my calm, unwavering gaze to the scattered photographs covering the mahogany dining table. The undeniable truth slammed into him with the raw, destructive force of a runaway freight train. The cognitive dissonance that had protected his fragile ego for months finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of my eyes. His father was not losing his mind. His father was not suffering from sudden paranoia, dementia, or any form of cognitive decline. His father was the only person in the room who saw reality with perfect, ruthless clarity. Derek turned slowly toward Heather. His hands balled into tight, white-knuckled fists at his sides. The veins in his neck bulged angrily against his collar. When he finally spoke, his voice was no longer the pathetic, trembling whisper of a defeated man begging for an explanation. It was a low, guttural growl built on a foundation of absolute soul-crushing betrayal. "You made me mortgage my house," Derek said, taking a slow, menacing step toward her. He ignored the graphic photographs, now his focus entirely consumed by the financial ruin she had just orchestrated. "You stood in our kitchen crying real tears about my father needing immediate psychiatric care. You begged me to help him. You made me sign a $200,000 loan this morning. You told me it was the exact amount we needed to secure his spot and save his life." Heather backed away instinctively, her hip hitting the edge of the dining room sideboard. The fake, sorrowful tears that had streamed down her cheeks just moments ago abruptly stopped. Her entire posture stiffened. Derek took another heavy step forward, his voice rising in volume and intensity until it practically shook the crystal wine glasses resting on the table. "You took that money and you wired it to him." Derek pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at Brenda, referencing her earlier declaration. "You wired my equity to your contractor boyfriend so you could run away together. You purposefully bankrupted me to fund your pathetic affair." Heather looked at Derek, then at Brenda, and finally at me. She realized her escape route was entirely blocked. The photographic evidence was irrefutable. The witnesses were completely unmovable. The cornered animal inside her realized that playing the weeping victim was no longer a viable survival strategy. The transformation was instantaneous and physically jarring to witness. Heather stopped trembling completely. She straightened her posture, smoothing the front of her burgundy dress with a remarkably steady hand. The innocent, caring daughter-in-law vanished. A cold, vicious sneer curled the edges of her lips. Her eyes darkened with profound, unadulterated contempt as she dropped the loving wife facade entirely. Heather threw her head back and let out a sharp, genuine laugh. It was an ugly, grating sound that bounced harshly off the dining room walls, entirely devoid of the sweet musical cadence she usually employed. She looked at Derek, not with any shred of guilt or remorse, but with utter, undeniable disgust. "You really are a pathetic loser, Derek," she spat, her voice dripping with pure, concentrated venom. "You are so desperate for validation, so eager to feel like the powerful man of the house that you blindly signed away your entire financial future just because I batted my eyelashes and shed a few fake tears. You did not even read the loan documents. You just grabbed the pen like a good, obedient little boy." Derek recoiled as if she had physically struck him across the face. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but Heather cut him off, her tone escalating into a triumphant, arrogant roar. "Do not stand there and act like you are some innocent, tragic victim in this scenario. You wanted to lock your own father in a psychiatric ward because it was easier than dealing with his actual problems. You wanted him out of the way just as much as I did. You hated feeling inferior to his success. I just had the stomach to actually execute the plan while you hid behind my skirt. You are weak, Derek. You have always been terribly weak. That is exactly why I found someone who is not." She gestured wildly toward the front window where the dark, freezing suburban street lay beyond the glass. "Gary is a real man. He took what he wanted, and he helped me take exactly what I deserve. Do you really think I was going to spend the rest of my life playing the dutiful, supportive wife in this suffocating suburban prison while your failing supply business drowned us both in insurmountable debt? I wanted out, and you happily financed my exit. Derek shook his head in sheer agonizing disbelief, unable to process the monster standing in his dining room. You are leaving me with $200,000 in debt, he whispered, the crushing reality of his financial execution finally settling over him. You completely destroyed my life, Heather sneered, stepping away from the sideboard and pacing the hardwood floor with an arrogant manic energy. Oh, I did a lot more than that, Derek. I did not just take your pathetic equity loan. Did you actually think I would settle for a measly $150,000? She turned her vicious, triumphant glare toward me, her eyes practically burning with a greedy, victorious fire. Your father thought he was so incredibly smart. He thought he could hide his millions while acting like a helpless, confused old fool. But I found his restricted trust documents sitting right on his coffee table. I saw the $2.5 million sitting unguarded in that account. Heather crossed her arms, standing tall and proud in the center of the ruined Thanksgiving dinner. You are all entirely too late, she bragged, her voice echoing with supreme, untouchable confidence. I went to a private notary this afternoon. I secured a fully certified, legally binding power of attorney. I already submitted the authorization to the wealth management firm. I wired your father's entire $2.5 million trust into an offshore account 2 hours ago. The transfer is completely untraceable. Gary is sitting outside in his truck right now waiting for me. I am leaving and we are flying to Europe tonight. We are leaving you both here to rot in your own stupidity. You are completely bankrupt, Derek, and your arrogant father is entirely penniless. Heather stood there breathing heavily, a wild, victorious grin plastered permanently across her face. She truly believed she had orchestrated the perfect, undetectable crime. She believed she had financially gutted my family and successfully secured her luxurious future across the ocean. I remained perfectly seated at the head of the table. I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not panic. I simply reached into the inner breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my smartphone. I unlocked the screen and navigated directly to my encrypted wealth management application. I tapped the screen once to refresh the primary financial ledger. I extended my arm slowly and turned the bright digital display directly toward her. Heather's triumphant, arrogant smile instantly froze. Her eyes locked onto the illuminated screen, unable to look away. The bold green numbers at the very top of the banking portal were absolutely undeniable. The balance of the restricted trust was exactly $2,540,000. Not a single cent was missing. The massive funds were completely untouched and fully secured. Her breathing stopped. Her eyes widened in absolute paralyzing horror as she stared blankly at the money she thought she had successfully stolen. The color rapidly drained from her face, leaving her looking completely hollow and utterly defeated. You did not wire anything, Heather, I stated, my voice echoing through the silent dining room with lethal, crushing precision. You submitted a forged document to an account that was heavily monitored by federal authorities. You thought you found a convenient black market broker who would look the other way for a handful of stolen cash. You thought you were the smartest person in the entire room. I placed the phone gently back onto the mahogany table and delivered the final devastating blow. That notary was an undercover FBI informant, Heather. You just handed a federal agent a forged document and attempted to steal $2.5 million on tape. Heather stared at the illuminated screen of my phone, her mind violently rejecting the reality of the words I had just spoken. Her chest heaved with rapid, erratic breaths. She shook her head, her perfectly styled blonde hair falling into her face as she stumbled backward against the mahogany sideboard. She refused to accept that her masterstroke of deception had been nothing more than a federal sting operation. You are lying, she shrieked, her voice cracking under the immense weight of her own panic. You are a crazy old man trying to scare me. Gary is waiting for me right now. We are leaving. She spun around, her high heels slipping on the polished hardwood floor, and lunged frantically toward the large bay window at the front of the dining room. She grabbed the heavy fabric curtains and ripped them open to look out onto the dark suburban street. She expected to see Gary sitting behind the wheel of his idling heavy-duty pickup truck, ready to whisk her away to the airport. Instead, the scene unfolding outside completely shattered her final remaining illusion of escape. Gary's truck was parked exactly where she had instructed him to wait. However, it was not idling peacefully. Brenda had maneuvered her black SUV directly behind the truck, completely blocking its exit. But Brenda was not the primary threat. The quiet, manicured street had been entirely taken over. 4 heavy, unmarked federal vehicles had swarmed the intersection. They boxed Gary in from every conceivable angle, leaving absolutely no room for him to accelerate or reverse. The red and blue emergency lights flashed with blinding intensity, casting harsh strobe-like shadows across the manicured lawns and the siding of the neighboring houses. Heavily armed agents in dark tactical gear surrounded the pickup truck. Heather pressed her hands flat against the cold glass of the window, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream. She watched in pure, unadulterated horror as 2 federal agents forcefully dragged Gary out of the driver's seat. They slammed him chest first onto the hood of his own vehicle, pinning his arms behind his back and securing him with steel handcuffs. The man she had banked her entire luxurious future on was currently being read his rights on the freezing asphalt. Her escape route was dead. Her contractor boyfriend was in federal custody. Her money was frozen. The complete and total realization of her failure washed over her, paralyzing her body against the window frame. Before Heather could even turn away from the glass, the heavy wooden front door of my son's house swung open with a resounding, authoritative crash. Heavy tactical boots hammered against the hallway floorboards. 3 federal agents stepped swiftly into the dining room, their expressions carved from stone, radiating an absolute, uncompromising authority. Right behind them walked my attorney, Robert Katz, carrying a sleek leather briefcase and projecting a cold, professional satisfaction. Heather backed away from the window, her hands raised defensively in the air, her entire body shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. "What is the meaning of this?" she screamed, her voice a shrill, hysterical pitch that grated against the walls. "You cannot just break into my house. We are having a private family dinner." Robert Katz stepped forward, coming to a halt directly across the ruined dining table. He did not raise his voice. He simply delivered the facts with the clinical precision of a surgeon amputating a diseased limb. The privacy of this dinner ended the moment you signed Malcolm Reed's forged signature in front of a federal informant, Heather Roberts stated evenly. "You are no longer in control of this house, and you are certainly no longer in control of your future." The lead federal agent stepped around the table and closed the distance between himself and Heather in 2 massive strides. Heather Vance, the agent, barked, his voice echoing with undeniable finality. "You are under arrest." He reached to his belt and unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. Heather let out a guttural, desperate wail. She scrambled backward, knocking over a dining chair, trying to put distance between herself and the agent. "No, no, no, this is a mistake," she sobbed wildly, her perfectly curated domestic facade entirely destroyed. "Derek, do something. Derek, tell them I did not do anything wrong. Tell them your father is crazy." She turned her tear-streaked face toward my son, begging him to deploy the same cowardly compliance he had offered her all year. Derek stood completely frozen near the fireplace. He looked at the federal agents, then at Robert Katz, and finally at the woman who had just confessed to orchestrating his absolute financial ruin. Derek did not step forward to defend her. He did not utter a single word of protest. He took one slow, deliberate step backward, pressing his shoulders against the brick of the fireplace, completely abandoning his wife to the authorities. His silence was the loudest statement he had made all evening. The lead agent grabbed Heather's right arm, twisting it firmly behind her back. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent recited, his voice a steady, rhythmic drumbeat over her frantic, hysterical sobbing. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." As the agent secured her left wrist, pulling the steel cuffs tight, Robert Katz opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of federal warrants. "You are being officially charged with multiple counts of first-degree wire fraud, conspiracy to commit bank fraud, felony forgery of legal documents, and severe elder financial abuse," Robert listed, checking off each devastating charge with ruthless efficiency. "The state has already moved to seize your personal bank accounts, and the $200,000 equity loan you attempted to steal has been intercepted and returned to the lender. You have absolutely nothing left, Heather. Every single avenue of escape has been meticulously dismantled." She thrashed against the agent's grip, her designer burgundy dress twisting and wrinkling as she fought a completely futile battle. Her cries filled the dining room, a pathetic, noisy end to her arrogant reign. I remained seated at the head of the table, watching the federal agents secure their grip on my daughter-in-law. I waited until her frantic thrashing subsided into exhausted, defeated sobs. Only then did I place my hands on the armrests of my chair and stand up. My movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of the fabricated weakness I had projected all week. I walked around the mahogany dining table, my dress shoes making no sound against the hardwood floor. The federal agents paused, allowing me to approach the woman who had tried to erase my autonomy and steal my legacy. Heather looked up at me. Her mascara was smeared down her cheeks, her eyes bloodshot and wide with sheer, undeniable terror. She was completely broken, stripped of her pride, her money, and her freedom. I stopped just inches away from her. I looked down at her tear-stained face, feeling no pity, no remorse, and no sympathy. I leaned in close, ensuring that my voice would only reach her ears. The tone I used was quiet, sharp, and cold as a razor blade. Did you really think a black man who built a $3 million empire from the ground up would be outsmarted by a greedy little girl? I whispered, delivering the final crushing blow to her shattered ego. I stood back up, adjusting the lapels of my suit jacket. I nodded once to the lead federal agent. He jerked Heather forward, marching her out of the dining room and dragging her toward the front door. She did not scream anymore. The absolute reality of her failure had finally silenced her. I stood in the center of the ruined Thanksgiving dinner, listening to the heavy front door slam shut behind her, knowing the checkmate was absolute. The heavy wooden front door slammed shut, cutting off the frantic wail of the police sirens and the chaotic chatter of the federal agents outside. The sudden silence that fell over the dining room was absolute and suffocating. The flashing red and blue lights slowly faded from the front windows as the unmarked vehicles pulled away, carrying Heather Vance off to a federal holding cell. I stood at the head of the mahogany table, my breathing, even my posture, perfectly straight. I looked down at the ruin of the Thanksgiving dinner. The roasted turkey was cold. The crystal wine glasses were abandoned. The glossy, high-definition photographs of my daughter-in-law tangled with a contractor still littered the expensive table runner, a grotesque centerpiece for a shattered household. I slowly turned my attention to the man standing near the brick fireplace. Derek was hyperventilating. His chest heaved with rapid, shallow gasps. He stared at the empty space where his wife had been standing just moments prior. The reality of his situation was crashing down on him with the full, devastating weight of a concrete slab. His marriage was a humiliating sham. His wife was a federally indicted felon, and his financial life was completely obliterated. The $200,000 home equity loan he had blindly signed earlier that morning was a binding contract. Even though the stolen funds had been intercepted by the authorities and frozen in a federal escrow account as evidence, the bank held a massive, irrevocable lien against his property. With his supply chain business already drowning in insurmountable debt and his name inextricably tied to a massive federal fraud investigation, the bank would undoubtedly trigger an immediate default clause. Foreclosure was no longer a possibility. It was a mathematical certainty. Derek looked around the room, his eyes wide and panicked, searching desperately for an escape hatch that did not exist. He looked at the floor, then at the scattered photographs, and finally he looked at me. His knees suddenly gave out. He collapsed onto the hardwood floor, landing heavily amidst the crumpled napkins and dropped silverware. He buried his face in his hands and began to weep. It was a loud, ugly, pathetic sound. "Dad, please!" Derek sobbed, his voice cracking as he looked up at me with tears streaming down his face. "You have to help me. I am ruined. The bank is going to take the house. My business is completely bankrupt. The mortgage is $200,000 and I have absolutely nothing left. You have to pay off the loan, Dad. You have millions in that trust. You can fix this. Please save me." I did not move toward him. I did not reach out to offer a comforting hand, and I certainly did not feel a single drop of paternal sympathy for the weeping man on the floor. I looked down at him with the cold, detached observation of an engineer inspecting a collapsed bridge. He was begging for a financial bailout, entirely blind to the catastrophic moral failure that had brought him to his knees. He still believed that a simple transfer of wealth could repair the rotting foundation of his character. I took a slow, deliberate step away from the dining table. I buttoned the front of my suit jacket, maintaining absolute composure. "Derek," I said, my voice echoing through the ruined room with a heavy, uncompromising finality. "You are asking me to save your house. You are asking me to clear your debts. But you are completely ignoring the price you were willing to pay to secure your own comfort." Derek sniffled, wiping his nose with the back of his trembling hand. "Dad, I was manipulated," he pleaded desperately, trying to shift the blame. "Heather lied to me. She told me you were sick. She told me it was the only way to protect you." I cut him off immediately, my tone sharp and unforgiving. "Do not insult my intelligence and do not insult your own." You were not manipulated, Derek. You were willing. You saw an easy way out of your financial stress and you took it. You sat at this very table and agreed to lock your own father inside a psychiatric ward because it was easier than dealing with your failing business. You wanted me out of the way. You wanted my assets liquidated to cover your incompetence. Derek shook his head frantically, fresh tears spilling over his cheeks. No, Dad, I swear I thought you were losing your mind. I thought you needed professional help. I took another step closer, forcing him to look directly into my eyes. When you agreed to lock me in a psych ward, you ceased to be my son, I stated, delivering the brutal reality check with zero hesitation. You chose a comfortable lie over a harsh truth. You chose to believe a woman who treated me with obvious contempt because confronting her meant confronting your own weakness. I spent 40 years of my life working in a steel mill where the heat melts the skin off your bones. I broke my back to give you a soft, privileged life. I paid for your education. I funded your business. I shielded you from the harshness of the world, and that was my greatest mistake. I made you weak. I made you soft. And when the time came for you to stand up like a man and defend your father, you handed me over to a predator without a second thought. I paused, letting the absolute severity of my words sink into his mind. I am not going to pay a single cent of your mortgage, Derek. I will not write a check to save your business, and I will not hire a lawyer to mitigate your bankruptcy. You signed the paperwork. You ignored the warnings. You abandoned your father for a woman who despised you. You built this prison with your own 2 hands, and now you are going to sit in it. You will lose this house. You will lose your business. You will start over from the absolute bottom, just like I did, because it is the only way you will ever learn what it actually takes to be a man. Derek stared at me in stunned silence. The sheer magnitude of my refusal finally shattered his last lingering hope of a miraculous rescue. He realized that the limitless safety net he had relied on for his entire life was permanently severed. He let out a devastated, mournful wail and slumped forward, pressing his forehead against the hardwood floor. He pounded his fists against the ground, weeping uncontrollably as the reality of his impending poverty washed over him. I did not stay to watch him cry. I turned my back on the pathetic scene and walked out of the dining room. I moved with a calm, steady rhythm, retrieving my heavy winter coat from the entryway closet. I slipped my arms into the tailored sleeves and adjusted the collar against the evening chill. I did not look back at the dining room. I did not look at the expensive furniture I had helped finance or the walls that would soon belong to the bank. I reached out and grabbed the brass handle of the front door. I pulled it open, allowing the freezing November wind to rush into the stifling, corrupted house. I stepped out onto the front porch and pulled the heavy wooden door shut behind me. The latch clicked with a sharp, undeniable finality, locking Derek inside the wreckage of his own monumental arrogance. I walked down the paved driveway toward my car, my breath pluming in the crisp night air. The suburban street was completely silent again. I unlocked my vehicle, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. As I pulled away from the curb and drove into the darkness, I felt an overwhelming, profound sense of peace. The dead weight of a toxic family had been cut loose, and my future belonged entirely to me. The federal justice system moves with a slow, grinding inevitability that crushes anyone caught beneath its wheels. Over the next 8 months, I observed the destruction of Heather Vance from a comfortable distance. She did not receive a shred of leniency. The federal prosecutor dismantled her pathetic defense utilizing the dashcam audio recordings, the forged notary documents, and the irrefutable digital trail of attempted wire fraud. When the presiding judge brought down the heavy wooden gavel, the sentence was absolute and uncompromising. 12 years in a federal penitentiary with no possibility of early parole. She traded her expensive designer dresses and pristine suburban kitchen for a concrete cell and a rigid, unforgiving institutional schedule. The woman who firmly believed she could outsmart a federal task force and steal a fortune was permanently reduced to a serialized inmate number. Gary met a similarly pathetic, entirely deserved fate. Without the financial protection of his contracting business to secure a competent defense attorney, he was forced to plead guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The court placed him in a minimum security facility upstate. The man who once bragged about stealing my mountain cabin now spends his days performing grueling manual labor in the prison laundry room. He scrubs the filthy, sweat-stained uniforms of other inmates for mere cents an hour. He is utterly penniless and completely broken. Brenda ensured the zero-asset infidelity clause in their prenuptial agreement was executed flawlessly through her legal counsel. The divorce was finalized in record time, and Gary walked away with absolutely nothing. Brenda, on the other hand, assumed total undisputed control of the contracting empire. She rebranded the company, entirely purged Gary's incompetent subcontractors, and secured 3 massive commercial development bids within a single financial quarter. She is a woman operating at the absolute peak of her power, completely unburdened by the parasitic husband she finally discarded. I received the finalized court transcripts and the asset transfer documents from Robert Katz, quietly archiving them in my personal files. The predators were effectively neutralized. I watched the news reports detailing the sentencing with a cold cup of coffee in my hand. There was no joy, only the clinical satisfaction of watching a mathematical equation solve itself perfectly. Heather and Gary attempted to steal a legacy, and instead they earned themselves over a decade in federal cages. The system worked exactly as I engineered it. The fallout for my son was entirely of his own making. Without the $200,000 equity loan to bridge his massive debts, the bank initiated an aggressive, relentless foreclosure on his sprawling colonial house. The bright neon eviction notice was pinned to his front door less than 60 days after our final Thanksgiving dinner. His supply chain business, already buckling under a mountain of mismanaged commercial loans, officially filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy just a week later. Derek lost the manicured lawn, the mahogany dining table, and the illusion of suburban supremacy. He lost everything because he willingly handed the keys to his kingdom to a woman who openly despised him. I did not intervene to save him. I did not answer his desperate voicemails begging for a financial rescue. I let the cold, unforgiving reality of the real world hit him with full, devastating force. A year later, I drove past a massive commercial construction site on the industrial side of the city. I parked my 10-year-old sedan across the street and watched the crew operating heavy machinery. Among them was Derek. He wore a heavy yellow high-visibility vest over a grease-stained uniform. His face was covered in thick gray dirt, his hands calloused and raw from hauling steel rebar and mixing heavy wet concrete. He was performing the exact type of grueling, bone-crushing manual labor I endured for 4 decades to build my own empire from the ground up. The physical transformation was striking and profound. The arrogant, soft posture of the failing businessman was completely gone. He carried a heavy steel beam across his shoulder, his work boots sinking deep into the freezing wet mud. He looked exhausted, physically broken, and profoundly humbled. He was finally learning the true value of a single dollar earned through honest sweat and physical agony. I watched him take orders from a demanding site foreman without uttering a single word of complaint. He wiped his brow with the back of a dirty leather glove, staring at the ground as he worked. This was the fundamental education I should have given him 20 years ago. Shielding him from hardship only manufactured a weak, entitled man. Forcing him to rebuild his life from the absolute bottom was the only way to forge a resilient, honorable character. I sat in my car watching my son work his grueling shift in the freezing November rain. I felt no urge to roll down the window or call his name. The process of rebuilding a ruined life is an entirely solitary journey. Derek had to carry that heavy steel beam on his own. He had to pay his massive debts with his own blood and sweat. He had to look in the mirror every single morning and confront the terrifying consequences of his own cowardice. That is the true, inescapable cost of arrogance. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the active construction site, leaving my son to his labor. He was finally becoming a man, and he was doing it entirely without my financial safety net. He was learning that a legacy is not handed down through blind generosity. It is earned through unyielding discipline. The soft suburban boy who signed his life away for a manipulative wife was dead. The man carrying steel in the rain was someone I might eventually be able to respect. But until that day arrived, he remained out of my life, paying the toll for his monumental betrayal. I drove straight from the industrial district to the quiet diner on Route 9. It was the exact same establishment where I first laid the high-definition photographs on the table and forged a reluctant alliance with Brenda. The afternoon sun cast long, angular shadows across the worn vinyl booths. I walked inside the restaurant and found her sitting in the exact same corner booth, wearing a sharp navy business suit and projecting an aura of absolute terrifying command. I slid into the seat directly across from her. The waitress poured 2 cups of black coffee and quietly stepped away from the table. We did not exchange pleasantries. We did not discuss the lengthy prison sentences, the brutal foreclosures, or the ruins of the marriages we had decisively ended. We simply picked up our thick ceramic mugs and took a slow, deliberate sip of the bitter coffee. We were two calculating individuals who deeply understood the brutal necessity of scorched earth tactics. We had successfully defended our respective empires by utterly destroying the parasites who foolishly attempted to feed on us. Brenda looked at me over the rim of her coffee cup. Her eyes were sharp, fiercely intelligent, and completely devoid of any lingering regret. I met her gaze, acknowledging the immense lethal capability of the woman sitting across from me. We had executed a flawless, devastating checkmate against two people who believed they were untouchable. We did not need words to validate the victory or justify the wreckage left in our wake. We simply sat in the quiet diner drinking our black coffee, sealing a formidable alliance built on mutual unspoken respect. The board was cleared, the liabilities were eliminated, and the king and queen remained standing. I placed my mug back onto the saucer with a soft click. Brenda mirrored the action, her expression carved from absolute confidence. We knew the war was permanently won. I left the diner and steered my car toward the winding roads leading up to Blackwood Ridge. The drive took 3 hours, exactly as it had on that fateful November morning when this entire sequence of events was set into motion. The mountain air was significantly colder now, carrying the biting, undeniable promise of deep winter. I pulled into the gravel driveway of my cabin. The space where the contractor's heavy-duty truck had been parked was empty, covered only by a thin layer of fresh frost. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked up to the front porch. The heavy silence of the forest greeted me. It was not a lonely silence. It was the profound, unbroken quiet of a secured perimeter. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The living room was exactly as I had left it. The hardwood floor, once tainted by the presence of a treacherous daughter-in-law and her deceitful lover, was clean. The invasive memory of their betrayal had been completely eradicated by the sheer force of federal justice. I did not dwell on the ghosts of their arrogance. I simply took off my coat, rolled up my sleeves, and went to work. I had come to this mountain months ago to winterize my property, and I intended to finish the job. I walked down to the utility basement and shut off the main water valve. I methodically drained the pipes, listening to the rushing water empty out into the basin. I bled the hot water heater, wrapped the exposed plumbing lines in thick foam insulation, and secured the ventilation grates against the freezing wind. I moved from room to room, checking the window seals and drawing the heavy thermal curtains. The physical labor was grounding. It required focused precision and steady hands. It was a sharp reminder that the foundation of my life was built on hard work and self-reliance. I did not need a team of contractors, and I certainly did not need an ungrateful family to manage my affairs. I fixed the cabin the same way I fixed the vulnerability in my life. I identified the weakness, I applied the necessary force, and I sealed the breaches. By the time I finished, the property was completely protected against the impending freeze. I walked back up to the main living area and built a fire in the stone hearth. I watched the flames ignite, the dry wood crackling and snapping as the fire rapidly consumed the logs. I pulled up my heavy leather armchair and sat in front of the blaze, letting the intense heat wash over my face. The dancing orange light reflected off the polished floors, bringing a deep, absolute warmth to the room. I sat in the quiet cabin and reflected on the brutal necessity of the path I had chosen. Society preaches a dangerous, suffocating lie about family. We are conditioned to believe that sharing genetic material creates an unbreakable, unconditional obligation to endure disrespect, financial exploitation, and emotional abuse. We are told to forgive the unforgivable simply because the predator sitting across the table shares our last name. I completely reject that philosophy. Blood does not entitle anyone to the fruits of my labor. Blood does not grant immunity from consequence. When a limb becomes infected with gangrene, you do not wrap it in a warm bandage and hope it heals. You amputate it to save the rest of the body. Heather was the infection, but Derek was the weakened immune system that allowed her to thrive. I loved my son. I spent decades working in the scorching belly of a steel mill to ensure he never knew the agonizing sting of poverty. I paid his debts, funded his ventures, and wrapped him in a protective shield of wealth. But that protection mutated into a curse. I manufactured a soft man who valued his own comfort over his father's freedom. When the moment of absolute crisis arrived, he chose a comfortable lie. He willingly participated in a conspiracy to lock me inside a psychiatric ward because it was easier than confronting the terrifying reality of his own failed marriage. I refused to feel guilty for letting him fall. Tough love is not cruel. It is the highest form of respect. I respected Derek enough to let him experience the crushing weight of reality. I respected him enough to let his house face foreclosure and his business file for bankruptcy. Rescuing him would have only confirmed his cowardly belief that actions do not carry permanent consequences. He is currently carrying steel rebar in the freezing rain, paying for his arrogance with blisters and exhausted muscles. He is finally learning the mechanics of survival. Perhaps one day, years from now, when his hands are calloused and his ego is completely dismantled, we might sit across from each other and have a conversation as two actual men. But until that day comes, my peace is non-negotiable. I chose my dignity over a toxic domestic illusion. I chose to defend the $3 million empire I built from nothing, ensuring that the wealth I bled for remains under my absolute control. A man who refuses to defend his own borders does not deserve to rule a kingdom. I drew the line in the sand, and I punished the trespassers with maximum prejudice. The slate is wiped entirely clean. I owe no apologies to the world for my ruthlessness. The predators who attempted to feast on my legacy underestimated the quiet strength of a man who forged his life in fire. They thought my silence was weakness. They learned at the absolute cost of their freedom and their futures that my silence was simply the sound of a steel trap waiting to snap shut. My conscience is completely clear. I stood up from the leather armchair and walked into the kitchen. I brewed a fresh pot of dark roast coffee, letting the rich, bitter aroma fill the cabin. I poured the steaming liquid into a heavy ceramic mug and walked over to the front door. I pulled it open and stepped out onto the wooden porch. The freezing mountain air hit my face sharp and invigorating. I leaned against the sturdy wooden railing and looked out over the vast expanse of Blackwood Ridge. The sun was beginning its final descent over the jagged mountain peaks, painting the horizon in brilliant streaks of violet, burnt orange, and deep crimson. The dense pine forest below was casting long, dark shadows across the valley. The view was absolutely magnificent, untainted by deceit, manipulation, or the noise of a ruined suburban life. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. The bitter heat warmed my throat and settled deep in my chest. I listened to the wind rustling through the evergreen branches, a steady, calming rhythm that affirmed my victory. I stood alone on the mountain, completely isolated from the chaos of the city. I am 69 years old, and I have never felt more powerful. I have reclaimed my absolute sovereignty. My assets are secured, my enemies are incarcerated, and my peace is utterly unshakable. I watched the last sliver of the sun dip below the horizon, embracing the quiet, beautiful darkness of the approaching winter night. I am exactly where I am supposed to be, standing firmly on the foundation I built with my own two hands. The silent checkmate is complete, and the board belongs entirely to me. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. For more life stories like this, like the video, and subscribe to my channel. See you in the next life story with love and respect. The final lesson is about the devastating power of silence. We are taught to react, to scream, and to demand immediate validation when betrayed. That is a foolish game. True authority thrives in the shadows. When you loudly declare your boundaries, you give your enemies a map of your defenses. When you stay silent, you become completely unpredictable. You control the narrative, the pacing, and the ultimate execution. Let them mistake your quiet observation for weakness. Tell me in the comments, have you ever used silence to outsmart a toxic person? Hit like, subscribe, and share your victories below today.